Your perspective on the transformation of the nation state paradigm in the digital age.
A state that cannot steal money won't hold together. So the fact that it is no longer necessary, nor can be imposed, means that we will begin to see the unwinding of the state.
Christ in Revelation. He comes back and confronts and destroys corrupt nations and worldly powers.
The absence of tyranny isn't freedom. Sovereignty is like maturity. You are not born sovereign. You are born capable of becoming increasingly sovereign in relationship with a larger scope of reality.
Inflation is roughly 50% of nation state revenue. If that goes away, well, then nation states have to shrink by at least 50%.
It might be that you have a series of civilization states that are themselves governed by their own independent AI systems. Or it might be that this collapses into a single global AI system.
Yes, and indispensable to that structure is the central bank digital currency.
Proof of work blockchain is of the same order of magnitude as the substrate upon which law and money sit. It's actually deeper than law and it's deeper than money. We're in a moment of serious profundity. We're in a moment where big things are happening. And so we have to be capable of thinking at that level, right? If we're not thinking at the level of where we are, then we're not in relationship with reality.
Jordan, it's so good to have you here. I've listened to a lot of your content. I got introduced to this corner. What do you guys call this? This little corner of the internet? Is that what you call it? I started listening to Jordan Peterson's lectures back in 2020, which were very transformative for me. I often joke that Jordan Peterson was a gateway drug to John Vervaeke. John Vervaeke has been a gateway drug to many thinkers like yourself, DC Schindler, Pajot, et cetera, et cetera. So I've really thrilled to talk to you, and especially the recent conversation you had with a guy on YouTube about your perspective on, I'm not sure what you're calling this, but the transformation of the nation state paradigm in the digital age.
Sure.
So maybe we could just start there. As we were saying offline, we probably need to synchronize on terms and concepts a little bit before we really get rolling. So maybe we could just start there, like defining what states are, what nations are, what states are, what nation states are. And then I think you also use the term civilization states. So could we just get into some of that vernacular?
Yeah. So you in our brief preamble, you gave me kind of free rein that this is a pretty nerdy group. So
Yes.
I won't hold back too much, let's say. So maybe just to start, civilization, and I think a phrase that came to my head just now is to say that the thing that we'll be talking about is something like the telos of civilization. And there's a big meta theory that I've been working on, and that many other people have been working on that informs this discussion. So within that category, on the left-hand side, or if you'd like below, okay, we've been building up this stack. There's a stable location that we could call culture, if you'd like. And the thing that is held together by culture in English, and by the way, I think also in the biblical narrative, you would call nations or peoples. I learned speaking with a Russian philosopher that they refer to it actually as languages, which is fair enough. And the thesis is that was a particular stage of the unfolding of the world. And by example, that the stage of neurology and behavior, animals, was the stage. And prior to that, organic life was the stage, as we're talking about big epochs of unfolding of possibility in the world. And that the cultural stage reached a point where we began entering into an entirely new stage somewhere around 10,000-ish years ago. It could be much longer, but the point is that the big heavy stuff happened in what we would call history, or the history of civilization. And the thesis is that civilization is an as yet not fully formed developmental stage. So if you have kids and you've watched a child begin to learn how to walk, and they kind of wobble for a while, and they maybe stand for a second, they take a partial step and they fall. Civilization, the entire history of civilization has been us in that moment. And we were sort of just not even quite toddling. And we're at the precipice, I propose, of a phase transition into the stabilization of that stage. And that's a description of where we are. This is, of course, by definition, very, very big picture.
Would it be, I, of course, this is metaphorical, but maybe it's even deeper than that. Like that, we could say that civilization is some kind of a social organism. Then you're saying like we went through these phases of like an inorganic layer that gave rise to an organic layer. You know, eventually we had single cell and multicellular organisms, and then eventually those organisms organize themselves socially. But then we take it to the next level with the
Right.
introduction of culture.
So we have three steps. We have behavioral organisms, which are driven by neurology, but as individuals. Then a particular subset of behavior, which is one of the things we're doing right now, called communication, facial expressions, verbalizations, things like that, enable the entrainment of individual organisms into larger scale distributed organisms, social organisms,
Right.
whether they're insects or schools of fish.
Yeah.
Within the category of social organisms, we begin to see these very particular, increasingly rich communication capabilities to start forming. You move from schools of fish to, say, for example, this is not linear, but categorically, to say like a herd. A herd is a more tightly bound social organism, and then a pack. A pack has got all kinds of new capabilities and starts to differentiate morphologies that you have specialization within them. You start seeing the potential and the leverage and power that happens when you can start exploring this new set of possibilities. And we get to say the hominid band, like a troop of baboons or a band of chimpanzees. And this is the precipice of the transition to what then I call cultural organisms. Right? So you move from organisms to social organisms to cultural organisms. And the move of cultural organisms, which, by the way, as we spend time in this, we'll see is the general category of how this move occurs, involves a generalization of the basic structure. So all social organisms are phenotypically bound. The content of what kind of organism they are. An Arctic wolf is an Arctic wolf. You take him out of the Arctic, you move him into the desert, he's not going to live.
Right.
What happens at the cultural level is we discover that we can move a very large portion of our phenotypic characteristics from hardware to software by virtue of constructing this thing culture, which is takes communication. We notice we can actually do symbolic abstraction inside communication. And with symbolic abstraction, we can begin to do things like produce counterfactuals. We can talk about possibilities that are not actually real. We can begin to formulate ways of being that are hypothetical in nature, and we can actually communicate hypotheticals with each other, which allows us to begin exploring possibility in the abstract space, which is a completely different energy cost than just trying to do trial and error in the physical space. Right? So cultural organisms sit in that novel innovation, which is not trivial, and have a particular, how do you say it? There's a whole bunch of things that are necessary to hold that together and make it function.
Yeah.
Because obviously, when you're talking about, say, a pack of wolves, and a lot of the characteristics of their sociality are hardwired, when you move it into the software mode, my friend Greg Henriquez calls what's needed here is systems of justification. Meaning, because we can have conversations in symbolic space, we need to have some methodology that can hold us together and bind us together as a group around things that are no longer directly constrained physically. So who's going to be in charge? Where are we going to go? We can have conversations and arguments about it. And we have methodologies for people to give reasons and notice that some reasons are good reasons and other reasons are not good reasons. And some reasons are, in fact, pure nonsense. And as a consequence, these systems of justification create a context that allow cultural organisms to bind together and hold and make decisions together. And by the way, finely grained decisions, you do that, let's coordinate over time. And then culture unlocks and we start getting this explosion of cultural organisms. And that's a big story, probably a million years ago to certainly 100,000 years ago. So it's a beginning a million years ago, 100,000 years ago. The Upper Paleolithic transition is what it's called. We really dial in cultural organisms, and then humanity explodes all over the world because instead of, you take a human who is well adapted for the desert, they migrate up into the mountains where it's cold. they're not like the desert or the Arctic wolf. They can just say kill a wolf and wear a skin, and turn that into a technology that allows them to move the phenotypic into the symbolic. Okay. And in the narrative, as I'm telling it, this is extremely effective. Humanity expands, fills basically every niche that's amenable, except for oceans and whatnot. Even oceans we travel across and hit ion
Creative
chains.
niches too, right?
Create entirely new niches, absolutely. And then we run into a problem, which is other cultural organisms become our primary competitor. We've sort of competed, we've outcompeted the elephants and the lions, we've outcompeted the desert and the mountains, we've established dominion over the world, and we encounter each other. And we haven't got a way to resolve encounters across a meaningful distance. So conflict and warfare is endemic at the level of cultural organisms, and actually at a pretty high level. So just continuous process of conflict at the boundaries. And just be clear, cultural organisms seem to be able to establish relatively high degrees of stability up to like the second or third cousin. So it's extended to say on the order of 100, 15,000, 25,000. But once you get beyond that population, the various kinds of rituals and techniques that were within the category of culture don't hold enough to break down. You start getting schisms, and then you start getting conflict, and that's sort of the limit. And so what happens is we begin exploring the next stage, the next possible frontier. Pardon. And this frontier is driven by two strong positives and then is held back by one significant category of negatives. One strong positive, and these days we have a very good name for it, which is Metcalfe's law. This is a very, very profound insight that the Santa Fe Institute and Jeffrey West explore in some detail in the book Scale. And this is that most natural systems scale either linearly, like if I'm just piling grains of sand on top of each other, or they scale sublinearly. They have an asymptotic curve as you add more mass to an organism. As you go from a hummingbird to a blue whale, what we actually see is metabolism per kilogram decreases.
Yeah.
So the heartbeat rate, the amount of energy consumption per unit of mass is going down as you get bigger. But specifically among humans, and specifically among they first found this characteristic in cities. When humans communicating networks get superlinear scaling on a certain number of characteristics for purposes of our conversation, most notably wealth and innovation. So if you take a group of people, let's say you've got 1,000 people in a group, and you double it to 2,000, the amount of wealth per capita goes up by 15%. So you've doubled the amount of people, but you've actually increased the wealth per capita by 15%, which means, of course, you're starting to get a significant difference between the people in the larger town and the people in the smaller town. If you double it again, it goes up by 15% again. And this, by the way, seems to be invariant across time, technological advancement, or population. Going from 2,000 to 4,000 and from 20,000 to 40,000 has the same characteristic. So what this means is humans that discovered that if you can get a larger population density into communication, this is critical. They have to actually be connected and coordinated in some kind of communication envelope, tap into this novel phenomenon, which we could just call the network effect or Metcalfe's law. And by the way, this also unlocks a very large number of constraints, which is that, well, when you put a lot of humans in the same place, you got a whole lot of new problems. You have to put them in, you have to give them housing, you have to get rid of their waste, you have to find a way to get food and water in. And this begins this spiral of, have we got technologies or techniques or methodologies to increase the population? If so, you get this network effect. Oh, wait, we've run into a constraint. We can't get enough water in. What do? Well, let's use innovation and wealth. How about we bring water from a long way away and we line these, giant aqueducts. Like, what? Really? Okay, let's try. Oh, okay, that unlocks a new expansion of population. Right? So these cycles. And then the other advantage is technology, meaning once we've moved into the symbolic layer, we get this very interesting capacity that once we've invented a technology and moved it into software, right, we're no longer trying to transmit know-how by means of observing a physical process and emulating it in physical space, which is, how do you nap a stone into a hand axe, we can actually transmit it symbolically. Hey, go there, look for this kind of thing. It's going to look like that. Bring it back here. I can explain it to you. And more know-how has moved into the symbolic layer. What that means is we can now transmit and maintain and compress the work of innovation in a completely new way. And so not only does a city of 100,000 have network effects in terms of innovation, it also is able to take the innovation of the grandfathers and the great grandfathers and the great great grandfathers and basically get 95% of it for free on the basis of symbolic transmission, teaching, learning, and then can build on top of it. And this, by the way, transmits even across highly distinct groups. So when the Sumerian Empire collapses and the Akkadian Empire pick up the ruins, the Akkadians get cuneiform writing without having to invent it.
Right.
They just get it for free. And that means, of course, that we enter onto this exponential. This is what drives the exponential growth of technology, right? The fact that inventing it is hard, teaching it is easy, and it can be transmitted across any particular boundary with very limited difficulty.
Yeah,
So those are the two big.
are inhibiting the retrogression, basically, right? That
Yeah,
you can accumulate.
at wildly high leverage.
Yes, yes. And you don't have to reinvent the proverbial wheel, as you're saying, right?
Exactly. And so this, we're standing on the shoulders of giants is a very nice, that's what's happening.
Yeah.
Okay, so these new kinds of entities, which I'll now just call technological civilizations. So we've moved from cultural organisms to technological civilizations. Civilization, city, civis, concentration of population, technology. Right. So that's the.
Is this industrial age? Where would you put, I mean, where do you start? Obviously, we
Oh
have to
no.
go back to the
Yeah,
bottom.
we're all the way back in agriculture.
Okay, got it.
The very emergence of agriculture, because agriculture both is invented by and for population density.
Yeah,
If I can,
I guess I was asking because I know, like, with the invention of the automobile, urban density exploded. So I didn't know where you draw the line for,
no, yeah, it starts at the very beginning, and then we have these step functions. So you've got the elevator, for example, allows us to suddenly build vertically, which means more people can live in the same place. Awesome. There's a whole essay I wrote on this called "From City to Civium" that covers some of this in detail. Okay, so but now we have the failure condition. We have the problem. The problem is that the civilization, or the set of techniques that enable us to do this civilization thing, are subject to a variety of failure conditions that render civilization so far inevitably self-terminating. Civilizations rise and civilizations fall. This is not true, by the way, of cultures. Like, we have good reason to believe that the Aborigines have been around more or less as Aborigines for like 50,000 years. Civilizations don't last that long. Even pharaonic Egypt didn't last anywhere near that long. And the half-life decreases as the technology increases. So I'll give you some examples. And by the way, those who are familiar with things like the sovereign individual, a lot of this will actually sound familiar, and that's because it is. So one is a major problem of moving the way that you live into the symbolic layer is that you can find yourself living entirely in the symbolic layer, otherwise known as delusion and disconnection. There's so many classic examples of this. We live it right now. Precisely what happens is we innovate a new level of capacity to produce wealth. We do. We produce wealth. We then are therefore disconnected from the consequences of our choices in reality, all the way down to the bottom, and are increasingly our local selection environment is increasingly competing in the cultural layer for status and prestige and position in the culture, not for the ability to deliver effective results in physical reality. Let's go with the corporation.
Yeah.
Pardon?
Productive layer.
Yeah, the productive layer. And so what happens is, we have another language for this, virtue signaling outcompetes virtue. And those who are more successful at optimizing for virtue signaling find themselves being successful locally at the cultural level, even though they're producing actual destruction at the level of effectiveness of the culture and surviving down. For a while, that's okay, because we're actually we've produced a opulence. We're very, very wealthy. And so the culture becomes more and more top heavy, with a smaller and smaller touch towards reality and a bigger and bigger burden at the level of cultural virtue signaling.
Yes.
And then it collapses.
This is like some type of a parasite host dynamic, perhaps, and then also, language that would be familiar to listeners of this show is like this is a stereotypical fiat politician, right? They're doing a
Yep.
non-productive rhetoric-based activity that is not producing anything of wealth. There's no good or service coming out of it. They're just extracting from the goods and services of others, basically.
Yep. Yeah, and this is so fiat is the great, another great example. And we can even do it at just the level of the notion of say GDP, regardless of what metric. Goodhart's law tells us that as soon as we identify a metric to optimize, that metric is no longer a valid measure of the thing we're trying to optimize, meaning there's a slippage between the symbolic layer and the real layer.
Right.
And you can use the symbolic layer really effectively, but as soon as you ground yourself fundamentally in the symbolic layer, you begin to enter into this disorienting problem. You say, hey,
Confusing map for territory.
yeah, you got it. Exactly. And you can imagine what happens when you get really, really good at being able to say, well, according to the map, we're in
Yeah.
utopia. And everybody's like, it doesn't look like the territory. And so
Yeah.
you collapse.
The farm at Okefenokee is a revolutionary new regenerative agricultural community. It features an 8,000 tree olive orchard, which they use to make their own olive oil, as well as a very large pecan orchard. All the animals on the farm are heritage animals, with some varieties over 100 years old and others thousands of years old. Fresh eggs are produced daily by the farm's chickens. Also, there are over 1,000 beehives that pollinate the over 200 heirloom fruits and vegetables and provide honey to all the residents. The farm makes its own molasses, unrefined sugar, herbs, and spices. The farm also features an herbal apothecary and a commercial kitchen. These are just a few reasons why the farm is the healthiest place on earth. To learn more about the healthiest place on earth, go to okefarm.com and use discount code BREEDLOVE for $21,000 off custom cabin pricing. Again, to learn more about the farm at Okefenokee, go to okefarm.com and be sure to tell them I sent you. iCoin Technology has released a slick new hardware wallet. It looks like a mini iPhone with a high-res 3-inch touchscreen and camera on it. The device has no Wi-Fi, no cellular connection, and no GPS. It is an air-gapped hardware wallet which uses QR codes and a camera to communicate with the Bitcoin network. It has a built-in camera which is required for air-gap operation, and it has an optional Bluetooth compatibility. It's really a brand new user interface and user experience for a Bitcoin hardware wallet. iCoin makes self-custody accessible, easy to use, and non-intimidating. It even comes with an optional custom iCoin thermal printer, so you can print out the private key and its associated QR code when you're setting up the wallet. This makes setup quick and simple. Also, it is easy to restore the wallet just by reading the seed phrase QR code with the wallet camera. And as we always talk about on this show, the only way you can truly own your Bitcoin is by having it in self-custody. So you need a device like the iCoin wallet to truly own your Bitcoin. So go to iCointechnology.com/breedlove today for 30% off the purchase of this sleek new hardware wallet. Again, that's iCointechnology.com/breedlove.
Other ones that are related are, I'll do at least two more. There's several more, but I'll do two more. The next one has to do with in the symbolic layer, there's two basic structures that enable civilization to scale while holding together. Remember, at the cultural level, we had to build systems of justification, which are, by the way, extremely context rich. And so if you think about a culture, it's hard for us to do because we don't live it this way. But if you're growing up in, say, let's just go with the Aborigines, in the Aboriginal culture, you know everybody really well. You know these people's life history. You know their parents, their grandparents. You know their stories. You know most of what they've been doing. And collectively, the group knows everybody else really intimately. It's extremely context rich, not just at the human level, but also at the environmental level. Right? You know the river that you live around intimately. And that context is a fundamental part of how the systems of justification work, right? Our symbolic layer is 10% and the context layer is 90%. And that's part of the category. But In order to scale, if I want to add more people into the group, one of the things I inevitably have to do is I have to decontextualize. And in fact, what happens is civilization makes that a virtue. I can decontextualize like crazy and start saying, look, I don't care anything about you as long as you can go on this assembly line and you can do this function repeatedly effectively. So I
Yes.
can decontextualize you almost entirely and only take a small piece of you and fit you into the complicated system machinery that we've designed. So system machinery, civilization is built upon basically two substrates. One substrate is formal institutions or system machines, and the other substrate is markets. And we'll talk about both because both have failure conditions built in so far. So formal institutions.
Sorry, just here, I would like you to really focus on market failure. This is something that I have not yet been convinced of. As an admitted anarcho-capitalist, I think I haven't seen convincing evidence of market failure. So I'd love for you to focus a bit on that, if you don't mind.
Awesome. Well, then I'll do the easy one first because I'm sure as a convinced anarcho-capitalist that you have no problem with the failure of formal institutions, and then we'll go to the markets.
Yeah.
So there's a huge amount of really interesting thought about how and why formal institutions fail. But the basic idea, the metaphor is that they are machines, and they're machines that are trying to run technological civilization using cultures as the primary agent. So if you think about the way a corporation runs, you have two different groups. You've got the people who are doing what they're told on the basis of a series of protocols and processes. And then you've got a small group that are trying to figure out how to actually be agentic and make choices. Now, there's a very effective corporation will push agency down, but you're just replicating the same problem at fractal levels. Okay, so notice, by the way, when you think about a machine, just think about like, I don't know, what's a lawnmower or an internal combustion engine. Pick your poison, even a shovel. What you'll notice is they break down. And the more complicated they are, the more rapidly they break down, the more small errors cause them to have catastrophic failure. Complicated machines, when they encounter complex reality, when they encounter the inevitable entropy of complex reality, begin the process of breaking down. And the more complicated they are, we actually have a higher carrying cost to maintain and run them. And we have a higher possibility of them breaking down. So it gets a bigger and bigger burden on top of it. And this is true at the physical level, right? If I can say an automobile or an airplane, I think about how much human activity and energy has to be put into maintaining a ship at sea and counting the complex reality of the ocean. But it's also true of a formal institution. So General Motors, right? So, and now here's the second problem. That's just a general purpose. The second problem is that one of the primary kinds of complex reality that complicated formal institutions encounter is humans. So humans individually and as groups. So what you get is when you get a big, let's say a corporation, inside that corporation, you will get a very large number of cultures, human cultural organisms that will begin to organize on the basis of culture. And they're actually competing with each other for the territory that has been conquered by the larger machine.
Office politics.
And if you've lived in an office, you know what it looks like. And here's the thing. The same thing happens in the Babylonian Empire, right? Every complicated machine, whether it's a political machine or an economic machine, they're basically identical, has this problem, right? So it has the problem of, can it respond and adapt to, let's say, what's called natural complexity? And how does it respond and deal and adapt to anthropo-complexity? Now, of course, you've got the double bind, which is the anthropo-complexity is how it maintains its ability to respond to natural complexity. So, right. So you get this little feedback loop where eventually entropy takes over and it becomes some combination of maladaptive, captured, corrupted, or just stupid.
Right.
Meaning its carrying cost and its desire to prevent itself from being captured means it can no longer actually respond to its environment. This is sort of the paranoid totalitarian state.
Yes. Is the anthropo entropy, is this actual humans changing the rules that are intended to bind that organization together? Because I'm thinking we're getting into corruption, basically, right?
Yeah. So you have basically
applied or they change over time.
You have like a 3-step process that feeds back. The first is, I will begin to engage in local optimization. I'll play by the rules, but I'll play by the rules to the limit
People-
that benefits me, which is very difficult not to have be this base state, right?
The agency problem, basically.
The agency problem. Second, some people will defect even on the rules and they will cheat and see if they can get away with it. So now I get a second order game theoretic problem is if I'm not cheating a little bit, then I'm losing, and I'm losing my share to the people who are cheating a little bit. Then the third stage is you begin the normalization of cheating a little bit, which now just becomes the rules are now subject to change. The rules themselves become an object of cheating. Whoever can most effectively bend the rules to their advantage. And if you've been watching politics for the past, 50 years, certainly the past 10, you've seen this quite clearly. And the point is that this is not something that has been novel. The founding fathers talked about this quite a bit in the Federalist Papers and trying to figure out how do we present it. And we continually try to design new approaches to complicated social machines to address and resolve these problems. But thus far, because of the degree to which at the end of the day they ground on cultures, but those cultures are never able to be symmetric with the totality, you get an imperial asymmetry, meaning whatever culture is in charge of the social machine is alienated from, separated from, and ultimately in a position to extract from the rest of the cultures, the rest of the humans that are entrained in the social machine, and this creates an irresolvable conflict. We're going to get to Bitcoin in a second. You can almost feel it. All right, so now let's move to markets.
Already making notes on
it. All right, now markets are tricky, and I had to think a lot to figure out why it is that markets fail the way they do. But the simple answer to the question is markets fail on the basis of the form of money that they use.
Okay.
Markets are dependent ultimately on money. And historically, we've had three basic kinds of money. Let's say topologically, three different kinds of money. We've had ledger money, which, by the way, has historically always been the most basic. When civilizations collapse and there's a reboot from the cultural level, it begins at the level of interpersonal debt relationships, which become increasingly decontextualized into ledger debt relationships, which then become tokenized.
Right. Initially in that context heavy layer you discussed where everyone knows everyone intimately. So it's easier to trade favors at that layer. But once you get past the Dunbar's number, you need some form of, it has to shift into the abstraction layer, basically.
You got it. And then of course we see the advantage is that as you abstract it further, you get to scale it more effectively. But, okay, so then we got the second kind, which is commodity money, which we could just say gold. Obviously, there's variations on the theme, but gold is the archetype for lots of reasons. And then the third, fiat. And we notice that two things. One, gold tends to become fiat. And the second is gold has its own failure conditions. So let me focus on that one, because that is I don't think I'm going to be able to kind of deliver on this categorically because I have not thought about it in enough relational context to get everything proper. But here's the basic thesis. I'm going to be importing a bunch of ideas from the meta theory, but let me just kind of bring it to you. If we talk about this relationship between the cultural and reality, virtue signaling and virtue, reality grounds ultimately all the way down to the bottom of the stack. And the bottom of the stack is energy. And I mean this at the level of physics. Right?
Yep.
In the unfolding of the layers of reality, it goes energy, chemistry, biology, behavior, culture. Right, this series of stages.
One question about that: could energy be power? So, like in the physics definition of power being energy per unit time, as I'm reflecting on something like Plato said, something like being and power. There's this identity between them. So, I don't mean to derail you, but just something I think about often. Like, do we ground it in energy or do we ground it in physics power?
Interesting question. Maybe something around that will come up. It would take a little bit of time to think about that to do it right now. And let me just start with energy because at least I've got that one settled. And we're talking about here is something in the domain of the quantum mechanics, and something in the domain of potentia. In other words, the quantum mechanics is probabilistic. We don't actually have a notion of location in space, possibly, by the way, not location in time. We have a probability of If it is reduced from energy into matter, from a wave to a particle, then it shows up as a particular location in space-time. So that's when I say energy, I mean something like raw potential, but not unstructured potential, potential that has structure. So structure and potential, then matter. All right. So if we want to be governing our choices on the basis of reality, it ultimately has to ground all the way into energy. If it doesn't ground all the way into energy, there will be failure conditions of the slippage between where it grounds
Right.
and ultimately energy. So gold, for example, doesn't ground in energy. It's a good proxy for energy. You can't make more, right? So unless you have a supernova handy. And to get it requires the use of energy, but it's only a proxy. And there's slippage that emerges between the lack of the ability of gold to be a direct connection all the way down to energy. And if we want to, we can zoom in on that gap, but that's a big piece of the failure condition. Another piece of the failure condition is the degree to which you reify gold, to use language we maybe use later, I make it idolatry. In other words, it doesn't go all the way up to the symbolic layer. It sits in this weird spot in the middle where it's neither energy nor symbol. And so what ends up happening is we quite often find ourselves idolizing it, making it an object of value itself, as opposed to a mechanism for the movement of the symbolic bound to the energetic. Right? So we're looking for, in a proper form of money, is something which is simultaneously maximally symbolic and maximally grounded in the energetic. And anything that doesn't connect those 2 points fails.
Integrity
And
of
so
story.
you want a map that is pure map.
Yeah.
You don't ever forget it, that it's map. Don't think that it's territory. And you want a mapping that is fully grounded in the absolute essential elements of the territory.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Almost like an isomorphism in a way.
Ideally.
Yeah.
Ideally. Yeah. And I think, and we'll talk about that. So then what you get is you get this really interesting, so when you look at the characteristic perturbations or warps on civilization structures that occur in the context of commodity money, there's basically 2. One is precisely the degree to which it begins to migrate up towards the more symbolic, which pulls it further and further from its grounding. You see, like its range maybe is here. It can't go all the way down to energy, even when it's pure commodity money, and it can't go all the way to the symbolic. So there's a power of making it more symbolic. So as there's an effort to make it more symbolic, numismatics, you go from raw gold to coins, you end up actually ungrounding it. And so its range begins to move into the fiat domain and eventually end up counterfeiting it. You degenerate it and it turns into pure fiat, which we all know what the failure conditions of that are. The failure conditions of pure fiat are the aforementioned delusion. You move into the delusional range, your monetary system is now increasingly just trying to manipulate symbols, and you completely disconnect from effectiveness in reality. The other failure condition of gold or commodity money, is what it does is it produces a local optimum that says that holding on to the symbol is an effective proxy for the actual coordination structures that deliver the value. So it's a kind of very particular kind of virtue signaling. And the phrase that I remember when I was a kid is the son of the Roman emperor asking his father, why do they take taxes from the shit shovelers guild? It's like, aren't they gross? Why do we take their taxes? And the emperor says, my son, gold has no smell. And this is an advantage and a disadvantage.
A good one.
Because the decontextualization, it means that if I have gold, regardless of why I have that gold, I get full access to its potential to unlock value in the economic layer. Well, you begin to see the same spiral we saw in the bureaucratic regime. If I take your gold, I've got the gold. It has now been laundered. I have causal agency on the basis of something that is not virtue. In this case, it's corruption. And what we actually see is a lot of that. We see the emergence that as soon as a form of commodity money begins to emerge in a civilization structure, you've moved from highly contextualized ledger, you actually see more conflict because the power of the money to abstract away from the causal structure creates a niche. And that niche is a niche of tyranny and a niche of robbery. And of course, this creates a series of feedback loops where to defend against somebody else coming and taking your gold. Right now, I'm kind of like in the Book of Kings. You have to build the capacity to defend and protect your gold. Saul comes up. We have a king who can defend us. But of course, we see that kings immediately exert downward pressure on the people, and you get these hierarchical pyramids. Oddly enough, produced as the logical consequence of the limitations of the form of money. So this is where the market failures occur, is the actual capacities of the form of money to act as the mediation layer. The medium has a message, and the medium carries the perturbations that produce the failure of the market conditions.
If I could make one just semantic quibble, if you don't mind, and I don't want to interrupt your flow here, so if I am, please just talk over me. I would actually classify that fiat itself is the market. It's not a market failure. It is we're categorizing it as a market failure, but what it's actually is an abdication from the market. Because what you're saying is, this is proven by the existence of a central bank legal monopoly, right? Like it has to exist as this coercively institution. I always say, like, it's a matter of which way the guns are pointed, right? Like inflation is legal counterfeiting, counterfeiting is criminal inflation. The same thing the Fed does by the trillion you and I go to jail for, right? So the existence of this coercive legal monopoly is proof that it wasn't emergent from the market. Fiat is not a market phenomenon. It's an anti-capitalistic, anti-market phenomenon. So
Yeah, this is right.
One quibble is like, it's not, if we adhered to the market, right, like honoring life, liberty, and property, then we would never end up with a central bank. So if we honored, private property, contract law, the debtor-creditor relationship, I don't think we'd ever end up with fiat. So my only quibble there is, like, I wouldn't classify gold. When gold turns into fiat, that's not a market failure in my book. That's a failure of us to adhere to market principles, if that makes sense.
Well, what I'm saying is that the fact that can occur is an endemic consequence of the inability of markets to maintain their health.
That is true. Yeah, I think it's related to the physicality of gold ultimately. That there is that invitation, the violence you described, that it can be totally stolen, right? So there's an incentive to abdicate from market principles and go and steal someone's gold, basically.
And or the flip, right? The flip is, hey, I noticed that I get a lot of utility if I can communicate with a larger population faster over longer distances by means of my monetary unit. Using commodity gold's a huge pain in the ass. Yeah. It slows things down. Let's turn it into a piece of paper.
Yeah. Right.
Hey, fucking great idea. And by the way, here's the thing. It works. We need to be very clear.
Yes.
As soon as I turn the commodity gold into a piece of paper, I unlock a lot of market value because I can actually get more people faster over a larger space.
Yes.
And I'm now on the slippery slope. So we need to be very careful. Both are true.
Yeah, this is where the stimulant metaphor is very useful. Like it can activate market activity in the short run, but it's coming at the cost of, long run recessions and whatnot.
Absolutely. And by the way, we can use a lot of the failure conditions we see at the civilization level, we actually see at the individual level. And like I call this the cocaine law. Like addiction is a really good metaphor. You take your cocaine.
At some point, I'll just throw it out there and then whenever you answer. This shift from virtue to virtue signaling seems to mirror this shift from gold to fiat in a way, right? Like we're unmooring ourselves in both the sense of physical moors and moral moors.
Yeah.
And this loop, right, where incentives are changing how we act, but we're also changing the incentive structures. There's a feedback loop occurring there. So
yes, and let's kind of like spend some time there. We notice historically that these two qualities they tend to be co-emergent. Mm-hmm. So when a given civilization is moving through the arc of the debasement of the currency in the fiat, we also see the debasement of morality in the level of virtue. And you can see what that would be, because a kid who's growing up in a world of an increasingly debased currency is witnessing virtue and virtue signaling are not the same. Hey, that guy, everything in my system is telling me that guy's a liar and a thief, but he's in charge and everybody seems to be paying a lot of attention to him. Maybe that's what virtue looks like. And so virtue gets confused. And when virtue confuses, it's literally the earnest, honest, naive sense, sorry, Gen Z, and begins to try to emulate what it perceives to be virtue, you literally occlude the ability to even notice what the difference is. And so and of course, obviously, as people lose virtue and they cultivate a greater and greater capacity to simulate virtue and virtue signaling, guess what they notice over here in the fiat side? Hey, I could take advantage of this like crazy. Hey, screw what do you call it? Neoliberal economics. Let's go with modern monetary theory. I can unlock this thing like crazy, and I can fuel my virtue signaling to infinity by simply pushing a button. Why wouldn't I do that? Because you're now completely unmoored from reality, and all the horizontal bindings that have been holding the system together in terms of the structures, the complicated structures, are now dissolving into delusion, into something which is pure signal with map without territory, and you collapse, right? So that's
people start to live a lie, actually, and embodied. They don't even know it, right? To your
they don't even know it. They have lost track of the fact that the truth was ever a thing in the first place.
Yes. So well said.
Forget multivitamins and other supplements. Animal organs are the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. You can get 100 times more nutrients from organs than you can from muscle meats. But the problem with eating organs is that they are difficult to find in stores, they are difficult to prepare, and even when they are prepared well, they often don't taste great. Thankfully, Heart and Soil Supplements has made consuming organ meats so much easier by providing powderized organs in capsule form. Organ meats include everything your body needs to thrive: vitamins, minerals, peptides, proteins, and growth factors. This is why organ meats were the most prized foods for our ancestors. Fortunately for us, Heart and Soil makes these treasured foods easily accessible. So go to heartandsoil.co today and use discount code BREEDLOVE to get started on your journey to optimal health and vitality. Again, that's heartandsoil.co, discount code BREEDLOVE. Have you ever wanted to start a business in the Bitcoin space? If so, then the Wolf Startup Accelerator could be for you. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to businesses developing in the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times each year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. Go to wolfnyc.com to learn more or apply today. Again, that's Wolf, WOLFNYC.com.
So these are examples. There's maybe 5 kind of core failure conditions that happen in the category of civilization structures. But these are some of the really big ones that are useful to get a hold of. And you can see how they more or less reveal each other, right? So you've got this problem of complicated systems becoming increasingly inefficient, costly, and then ultimately corrupted and stupid. You've got the lifting into the symbolic layer and the dilution of virtue to virtue signaling in institutions, and seeing the same kind of thing happen in markets. And then you see the kind of the endemic failure conditions of tyranny in institutions, which is to say, because there's an asymmetry between the agentic group that is operating culture and the service group that's running the machinery, that you just get this lift and all formal systems become something like tyrannies. And you see the failure conditions that have not yet been resolved that cause markets to either collapse into the failures that we see with commodity money and or mutate into fiat, which then eventually evaporates.
Could we say that simply as the centralization of money leads to the centralization of all other institutional forms?
Yes, but I wouldn't want to get causally too tied up, which is to say that other institutional forms will centralize under their own power, and will tend to also push the centralization of money. So there's sort of centralizing factors that are going on in general. And as money becomes more centralized, because we're talking literally about the 2 basic structures, as money becomes centralized, that's going to cause this to have to centralize in a very profound way. But the reverse is also true. If this becomes, Pharaonic Egypt is not going to allow a decentralized monetary system.
Right. Still a feedback loop. Yeah.
Okay. So this kind of puts us in So maybe why don't we do this? Let's take a look at where we are now. Let's use this model and talk about where we are now. We've been entrained in a very unique form of civilization called neoliberalism, which has leveraged heavily a very intelligent design structure around how markets can be used as a form of highly distributed governance. So it leaned heavily on markets, noticing the failure conditions that happen inside institutional structures. I'll diagnose neoliberalism in a second, but it's reaching the limits of its capacity to continue to maintain itself. And it is in a accelerating destabilization phase, i.e. it's breaking up, let's say like the Roman Empire in 400 AD-ish. And therefore, some new things are beginning to pop through, right? When the power of a given entrainment structure is weakening, things that were in it but were not yet able to pop through are beginning to say, hey, I can take that resource. I didn't used to be able to, because there used to be police that prevented me from taking it. Now I'm going to take it. Or used to be government, which wouldn't allow me to grow crops. I'm going to start growing crops. This can be positive and negative agency, because at the end of the day, it's just agency. So we're taking agency in the interior. So the hypothesis is that, let me see if I can get the vocabulary. So we have nation states. We have the world state that is neoliberal globalism. We have civilization states. And then we have things that I'm calling nations without states. That last one is a neologism that I think I invented. Okay. Okay. Now, if we want to, we can talk about the global state that is global neoliberalism. But the basic idea we're all very familiar with, which is that there is a set of institutional forms that are highly abstracted. And what would they call them?
NGOs.
Pardon?
NGOs, non-governmental organizations.
No. I mean like our the global order. The norms, the various kind of legal norms of how things operate, things like the World Trade Organization, what it means to be a member, how SWIFT operates. Like these are all institutional forms that have evolved since World War II, largely around endeavoring to entrain the entire world into a single market structure.
World Bank,
by the way, pardon?
World Bank, IMF, all of these.
Those kinds of guys. Yeah. And by the way, American military hegemony, which says, hey, as long as you play by the rules of neoliberalism, more or less, we'll leave you alone. And by the way, we're going to maintain the necessary peace for that to occur. And we're going to subordinate all nation states are subordinated to a meaningful extent to this world economic order. So they can participate in the world economic order, which has the advantage of a stimulant. And it has the advantage of
the rule-based order, which is ironic because there's not actually stability of rules, which we've already touched on, but we'll probably go back to.
Which everybody outside of DC gets.
Yes, yeah, right. Exactly.
Everybody outside of DC gets, there's stable rules, which is to say whatever DC says goes, more or less. Decreasingly, though, and that's part of the point.
Yes.
We can see the friction. We can see the pushback. We can see people saying, oh, yeah? Why don't you make me? And us kind of not being able to make them, and a lot of other people going, maybe you're not as tough as you used to. All right, so you got this reciprocal closure. Yeah. The engine of liberalism, which eventually just has to become neoliberalism, is a very powerful engine, because what it does is it sits on top of cultures, which are, remember, they're relatively stable. And this is why the nation state is a primary atomic unit. It sits on top of cultures, and that it impresses a very particular kind of wealth-producing extractive institutional machine on top of cultures. And it uses that to maintain peace between cultures. And this is really important. Remember, we were never able to figure out how to get more cultures to stop fighting with each other way back before civilization. One of the ways we ended up doing that is we created empires. So an empire says, hey, I'm the most powerful. Y'all shut the fuck up. If anybody gets out of whack, you tell me, and I'm and I will categorically destroy them. So now I have relative local peace under sort of a minimum viable tyranny. And, that's kind of the model that the founders even said that we're all going to individually, this is liberalism says, we're all going to individually give our sovereignty to a single state who controls power that can beat up anybody. And now everybody no longer has the ability or incentive to fight with each other. And now all we have to do is make sure that thing's not too tyrannical.
Yeah.
So that's the solution.
Yeah.
And so we get to liberalism. Liberalism says, hey, the form of state that emerged in the West that was a kingdom state and religion, right? And these two things operating in an equilibrium stopped working. We had a schism at the level of religion, and we started seeing that states started fighting. The thing that was able to cohere the West, Christianity, broke. Now the states were no longer unable to stop fighting, and now they're actually fighting more. We need to put something new on top, and that new thing is basically going to be stimulants. We're going to say, hey, if you take a hit of liberalism, you're going to get a really nice hit of peace, which is good. You want that. And you're going to get a really nice hit of material wealth, which is really nice because we're all starving to death. We've been fighting each other for 30 years. Everybody's starving to death. Everybody's anxious. Liberalism is going to give you a hit of serotonin, and it's going to give you a hit of dopamine. It's going to feel real good. And the reality is, it was a definitely useful thing, right? We were stuck at that point. But the problem is, it does this at the cost of unmooring from the base layer, from reality layer, right? It goes back into the same dynamic, and it corrupts. By corruption, what I mean is consume is even better. Metabolizes a lot of the complexity of the anthropological and the natural layer. So an easy example is it takes a human being who is a person. And I'm going to use the distinction between persons and individuals. So it takes a human person, which is to say a person who is known as a person. Your mom knows you. You're a person to your mom, hopefully. If not, I'm very sorry for you and pray for you. But for the most part, your mom knows you. Your family knows you. Maybe if you were lucky enough, you grew up in a community where you had friends and people around you who knew you, and they knew you at a level of intimacy. Right? So the person is known at a level of intimacy. What neoliberalism does is it can't deal with people because it needs to build complicated machines that can coordinate people into increasingly effective wealth production. So it takes a certain part of you, and that part of you is the part that is legible, visible, and useful in the context of the institutional machine, and it converts you into an individual. And then it can combine individuals into new, very utilitarian, effective constructs. Okay, I'm going to take you 100 people, and you're now going to go work on that assembly line. And as a result of working on that assembly line, we're going to start making cars, and cars are really nice. And so now we have a lot more material wealth. And if you work there, you'll get a job, which will give you money. Money will then coordinate you with everybody, all these other individuals who coordinated this coordination structure, and we will get a significant increase in material wealth. And in fact, that works. There's a tremendous amount of gradient that happens when you can entrain, again, back to the beginning, a larger population in a shared coordination structure. You get network effects, and you get the escalation of technological innovation, a very powerful super stimulant. But at the cost, though, of becoming less and less of a person and more of an individual. And what it gives you back to try to replace that loss of personhood, which is complex, with individuality, which is complicated, are simulated personhood, right? Which I'll call identity. So you move from persons to individuals to identities, and identity is simulated personhood. But just like virtue signaling is simulated virtue, identity isn't actually load bearing. You can't actually build relational structures on identity. Right. This same thing happens, by the way, at the level of communities. You replace communities with societies, and then societies become simulated communities, which you might say, like, I'm part of the, I'm trying to think of an example that won't get me radically canceled. We have them online right now. I use what do they call it? I don't know how it's pronounced. Groyper? Groyper?
I don't know this one.
Griper? These are like the sort of like 4chan derivative pseudo neo-Nazi characters.
Okay.
So they are a simulated community, right? They're not a society. They have something like ideology. An ideology produces a simulated community. As soon as I sign up to an ideology, I think that I'm part of something that has a characteristic of lived community. Right. But I'm not only not, I'm even further removed than I was before.
Yeah. So even social media probably.
Social media, all of social media produces. Even the last strike, I'm a member of the online community, and I have to put quotes around it because we kind of think that's what community is, but it's not community at all.
Yeah.
And so what happens is this is an extractive process. Neoliberalism can't help but do that because it has to convert persons into individuals to fit those individuals into the machinery of wealth production and innovation.
The data compression of the person into the individual.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's useful, but the problem is utility is only one vector of meaning.
Exactly.
And neoliberalism sees utility very, very clearly. It sees all the rest of it very poorly. And so it enters into this. And so the only way for it to operate is it has to either expand horizontally. We got to get China as part of this thing. There's a whole bunch of persons in China we need to convert into individuals. Let's get them on this system and entrain them even more fully into this global machine of wealth production. Or it has to go deeper. Like, we're going to go all the way down to the core of your soul. We're going to go all the way down to the core of every single community aspect and start intermediating. Well, and classic, we're going to intermediate motherhood and childhood. We no longer have mothers and children. We have professional caretakers that simulate motherhood for children. And by the way, quite ubiquitously. And the problem is that this is natural and anthropological complexity at its base. And this is now the complicated system going down and consuming all the complex resources that it actually needs until it runs out of them, and it can't regenerate them. So that's the end of neoliberalism. That's where we are. Okay, so the next one, we have the civilization state. Let's do the civilization state, the nation state, and then the nation without states. Is that good?
Sure.
All right. The nation state is this is a historical artifact, right? The nation state emerges during the emergence of liberalism. It says, hey, what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to do this minimum viable state structure, no more empires. The only empire is going to be the empire of liberalism. And liberalism is going to be lightweight, thin, abstract, so that the nations can begin to coordinate with each other. So it sees, somewhat properly, let's say, that nations, peoples, cultures are a stable legacy of history. We produce cultures are stable. This is, okay, we're going to identify that the nation is an atomic unit. We think that empires are an artificial unit, which, by the way, was ubiquitous, and empires create trouble. So what we're going to do is we're going to break things down into these atomic units, nations. Each nation is going to have a state, but its statehood is really just the API that allows it to plug up into liberalism. So the statehood of let's say, I don't know, let's go with Czechoslovakia, which is pretty funny, right? That was actually a nation state, which then had to break into Czech and Slovak because it wasn't able to be stable it didn't have the imperial capacity to hold two nations together. And it wasn't, in fact, actually atomic. The Czechs were like, we're not Slovaks. The Slovaks are, we're not Czechs. Screw that, we're separating. And then tries to maintain it with these liberal institutions on top, right? So that's the nation state is only viable as a function, as something that sits with liberalism on top of it. And it holds nation states into liberal coordination structures. And again, liberalism has to have these feedback loops of moving from the natural complexity and anthropo-complexity up into complicated systems that produce utility or material legible wealth. And if that starts to run out, the engine starts to cough, the nation states start to get very unstable, and you start getting endemic conflict between them. So we're seeing that happen as neoliberalism is beginning to break down. We're starting to see make America great again. We see a nation state that has noticed that it has been moving a lot of its agency up into the neoliberal world order. It's saying, hey, I'm going to look out for me. I'm going to bring it back here. And then you see, well, how do these nation states interact with each other horizontally? Yeah. How does the United States interact with Mexico? Well, it can interact with Mexico the way that things worked before neoliberalism, which ultimately will be something like power and conflict, and you'll see something like empires emerge. Okay. So civilization states. Civilization states are relatively long-lived empires. So they have a combination of two factors. One factor is they include a variety of nations inside of them. And the second factor is they were able to live for hundreds or thousands of years with some level of continuity. And so they have built in a lot of shims and structures that in a very, complicated way, hold that empire together. So the classic example is China. On the one hand, we can say that China has maintained continuity for thousands of years. On the other hand, that continuity has an arc of rising and collapsing in catastrophe, but it maintains continuity over time. So you have the Han rise and fall, and I think it's the Tang who come after them. And you have like a 70% population reduction. You have a complete destruction of the political structure, significant border reorganization. But when the seeds transmit across, it rises back up, and it still sees itself as being China. So this is a civilization state. It has been able to maintain itself even though there are rises and falls. It has not, in fact, been fully shattered. Russia sees itself, by the way, as a civilization state with continuity from Byzantium. So it sees that possibly even Rome goes to Byzantium, Byzantium goes to Russia, same civilization, running something like the same basic kind of code to hold itself together. Now, the thing is, because these are deep, I mean, historically they go very deep, they're written in to a very large number of very subtle and deep grooves, probably, by the way, even at the genetic level. Because there's just been coevolution between selection of people and the civilization structure they've been in for enough generations for it to leave a mark. Certainly at the linguistic level, certainly at the deeper institutional level, like culture, norms, basic norms of how you raise your kids. We're talking about stuff that is right above culture, maybe at the level of culture. So the interface between the two. So the natural consequence is that as the candy coating layer of global neoliberalism breaks, the deeper, older structures begin to reassert themselves. Have you ever been to a science museum where they had a simulation of a tornado?
I've seen them in liquid, so I guess that qualifies.
Yeah, sure. Same thing, right? As a kid in the bathtub and you see the vortex form, right?
Yeah.
And you notice that
structure. Yes.
That if you interrupt it, like you wave your hand through it, it breaks apart and then it reforms. Well, what's happening is the memory of certain characteristics, in this case, literally just the vector of the molecules, is maintained, and the attractor of, in this case, water going down the drain. Those two pieces recohere.
Yeah.
Civilization states are like that. There's enough memory and enough components, and there's something like a basic attractor of how do you resolve integrating cultures in something like generative peace, that cultural memory kicks back in. And when the 150 years of global, or whatever, 100 years of global neoliberalism begins to break apart, these reassert themselves. And we're seeing that, right? We're seeing Russia reassert itself as, by the way, an orthodox empire. We're seeing China reassert itself, no longer as a Western communist empire, but in fact as China, which is Taoist and Confucianist, et cetera. I would be shocked if a diagnosis would say India is doing more or less the same thing. Right? So
I think that's really fascinating. I love the metaphor, and then I feel like it also mirrors the flight to safety we see where, when fiat currencies fail, people fly back to gold, right? It's that cultural memory. It's like, well, this thing's been working for 5,000 years. This paper money 100-year experiment just ended. Let's just go back to what we were doing before.
You got it. Exactly. And 5,000 years is about as long as we can remember. So we might say, well, it hasn't worked for 100,000 years. People are like, I don't even know what you're talking about, dude. Yeah. If it's worked for 500 years, I'm good. Yeah. So exactly that kind of a thing. And you notice, by the way, that gold purchases have been going up in places like India and China and Russia because their cultural memory is that. Yes. That's the kind of thing. And it's interesting. You don't even have to have a robust theory for why.
Right.
It just is intuitive cultural memory is enough. And that actually begins to orient you back towards these more stable structures.
Yes.
Would you rather have 1 Bitcoin today or 2 Bitcoin a few years from now? Bitcoin mining is a tried and true strategy for accumulating Bitcoin. Over a 2 to 4 year time frame, successful miners have consistently accumulated more Bitcoin than they otherwise would with a traditional dollar cost average strategy. Blockware mining as a service enables you to start mining Bitcoin from your laptop. Blockware handles everything from securing the miners to sourcing low-cost power to configuring the mining pool. They do it all. Plus, with Blockware's one-of-a-kind mining marketplace, you can buy and sell live Bitcoin miners with just a few keystrokes. In this marketplace, buyers get to purchase live machines at vetted facilities, enabling them to mine with zero lead time. And sellers get the opportunity to liquidate their machines and hosting contracts at will. This means you can mine Bitcoin with zero long-term commitment and high liquidity on your mining rigs. Blockware will even cover your energy bill for 1 week per mining rig when you sign up at mining.blockwaresolutions.com/breedlove. Again, that's 1 free week of Bitcoin mining at mining.blockwaresolutions.com/breedlove. And on top of this offer, you can also use code BREEDLOVE to get $100 off your first mining rig with Blockware Solutions. Bitcoin custody is evolving. Both self-custody and single third-party custody come with significant risk and trade-offs. Onramp is pioneering a new standard, multi-institution custody, which eliminates single points of failure, adding fault tolerance and redundancy to your setup. Onramp secures your Bitcoin in a segregated cold storage multi-sig vault guarded by 3 independent institutional-grade custodians, none of which that have unilateral control over your assets. More than just security, Onramp simplifies inheritance and estate planning, ensuring your Bitcoin wealth moves seamlessly to your loved ones without the risk and complexities of self-custody. Easily designate beneficiaries right in the Onramp dashboard, eliminating the need for unreliable treasure maps or other complex key sharing schemes. You can also avoid the probate process and ensure your heirs receive their Bitcoin securely with legal title transfers designed to keep your wealth intact for generations. As Bitcoin continues to appreciate, Onramp helps you seamlessly access financial services, from inheritance and insurance to trading, loans, IRAs, and more, all without compromising on security. And importantly, the onboarding process is fast and frictionless. I set up my own Onramp account, and it was far easier than dealing with hardware wallets or traditional self-custody setups. The team walked me through everything step by step, making sure I had a secure, reliant setup for my Bitcoin wealth. Secure your generational wealth with confidence. Schedule a consultation with the Onramp team today at onrampbitcoin.com/breedlove. Again, that's onrampbitcoin.com/breedlove.
And again, part of that cultural memory is being propagated through imitation, right? It's people imitating what their parents or grandparents have done for, generations. And so in India, they have, for instance, they have this sort of they romanticize gold. It's not a propositional understanding of, oh, this thing has the most holds purchasing power over time. Maybe it's something that you, but it's really just this cultural transmission from generations past.
Yeah, in fact, Pageot talks about the notion of, so I'm going to do a little divergence, but this is super helpful. We can talk about symbolic depth and symbolic endurance. So we take this notion that if you spill salt, the proper thing to do is to pick it up and throw some of it over your left shoulder. Now, here's the thing. This actually is common across a diversity of cultures and over long periods of time. So a hypothesis is that maybe it's not completely meaningless. It's absurd to imagine that it is, actually, because why would it keep showing up all over the place? It's not like anybody's forcing anybody to do that. Well, the way he describes it is that there's a deep symbolic structure, and it goes like this. Salt has 3 really powerful virtues. One is salt improves the quality of other good things. It makes sweet taste better. It makes ice cream and steak both taste better. Right? It's a quality enhancing thing. Salt also preserves good things. You put salt on the meat does not spoil. Okay. Salt also purifies things. You put salt in the cooking, you put salt in the soup, you put salt in the water, it has less toxin, less bacteria. So salt contains within itself these 3 virtues at a very profound level. And every human being ever has experienced that reality. When you spill the salt, what you are doing is you're converting it from a form that is useful into a form that is not useful. Right? You've done something stupid. You've been incompetent in some thoughtless way, because you would never convert something useful into something that is not useful on the basis of wisdom. You would do it on the basis of foolishness, recklessness, incompetence. So when you spill the salt, you're symbolically enacting that general function of despoiling something that is quite useful. So what do? What you do is you enact a ritual which reminds you not to be stupid again. You pick it up and you throw it over your left shoulder. Now, your left hand, by the way, generally speaking, for most people, not everyone, is your incompetent hand. right? It's the part of you that is not able to throw a ball well. It's not able to write well, right? It's not the one that you sword fight with, right? It's the one that has more incompetence. And so symbolically, the left hand represents that. So you throw the salt over your left hand, you're reminding yourself, be thoughtful about where you're incompetent, be mindful so as to not despoil that which is good. And as a basic structure, this is extremely useful and therefore extremely well coded. Same thing across everything, gold. What does gold represent? Gold represents a whole series of symbolic memories that, shit hits the fan in India often enough. People are like, it turns out that everybody who held on to gold made it. We're going to keep that in the family tradition. We're not going to lose that kind of defensive memory. Okay, so that's that piece. And left to its own devices, there's really two future paths. One future path is the civilization state future path, which is, okay, the world will be broken up into some number of empires that will be in relationship with each other through some kind of complicated geopolitical arrangements. And there'll be a Chinese sphere. There'll be some kind of American sphere, maybe, if America can actually hold together. It's not clear that we're a civilization state. And maybe the whole West is a civilization state. But remember, liberalism is the emergence of the West post-Christianity. So the only civilization state that we have is actually premised on a coherent Christianity. We don't have that. So it's not clear what happens there. Russia, on the other hand, is saying we're a civilization state we can establish. Even though we may not be a major player, we're not going to be a trivial player, et cetera. So that's one timeline. I don't think that's a stable timeline, but we can hold that as one timeline. It's not stable because of the second timeline. The second timeline is the emergence of ultra-liberalism in the form of AI. So AI is maximally decontextualized. AI is maximally able to modulate human beings as individuals into increasingly fine-grained behaviors without any regard to their personhood. Right? So oddly enough, the Chinese are the furthest ahead in enacting ultra-liberalism in the social credit system. Right? So it produces a very, very thin layer on top, which is extremely subtle in how it operates. It uses almost no tyranny or force in the gross sense. It's pure tyranny in the most fundamental sense, but nothing in the gross sense. You can't really tell. And then is able to modulate human behavior under an algorithmic structure, which makes them, in principle, by the way, highly useful.
Yes. And indispensable to that structure is the central bank digital currency, right? That subtle social engineering, instead of doing the force, bludgeon over the head to get you to do what I want, they're just using incentives, basically.
Yeah, absolutely indispensable is a singleton. So not just centralized, but a singleton, one that extinguishes all other competitors.
Yes.
Completely ubiquitous. And it has to be digital so that it can have the combination of access to digital intelligence and access to the fine-grained movement in space and time. So I need to nudge you at the very, very tiny, tiny level. And by the way, it can add qualities to it.
And the programmability, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Programmability. So that's scenario number two. Now, scenario number two and scenario number one might connect. It might be that you have a series of civilization states that are themselves governed by their own independent kind of AI systems. Or it might be that this collapses into a single global AI system. Now, those are the two that are kind of, by the way, out there. Like if you talk to people at the World Economic Forum, particularly people like Yuval Harari, he's like, yeah, it's number two. I don't know what you're talking about. There are some people who think it's number one, and that's that. So now I'm proposing that there's a third. And the third of these nations without states, and this concept called hyperstructures, or for those who really, really want to have a belly laugh, Bitcoin fixes this. And I'm not kidding, right? So the point is, I'm making an argument on the basis of a theory of the nature of reality that goes all the way down to the transition from energy up to matter, to chemistry, to life, to behavior, that says that, oddly enough, proof of work blockchain may be the resolution to the toddler stage of civilization, and therefore gives rise to a metastable state that doesn't fall into the error conditions of civilization and allows us to avoid either of the first two timelines.
That is profound, to say the least. And again, it seems like an important point here. We keep coming back to map versus territory. that Bitcoin is this radical integration of the two, right? It's like a map that's inseparable from the territory.
Yep.
And it somehow is imposing or inducing an integrity into us individually, us into our institutional forms, us into our market forms, et cetera. And it's radical. And this is where the what is money question is so fascinating to me. It's like, how is that technology, right? It's just money. I mean, just money. It's this like weird binding agent for the whole collective. And so
Yep.
if you purify that binding agent, it leads to like a purification of all of the products that emerge from it.
Yes, that's a very good way of putting it. If you purify, or to put it the other way around, the kinds of corruptions that are intrinsic to the binding agent inevitably show up as the corruptions of the thing that it binds.
Yes. Yes.
And we could say, okay, well, let's take a look at, and I'm going to, we'll define now, just because the ease of use, I'll say Bitcoin. When I say Bitcoin, what I mean is proof of work blockchain. Okay, so obviously there's variations on that theme. And my personal favorite right now is, in fact, actually Quai, not BTC. And I've got concerns that BTC may have already made one or two political choices that are not going to be effective. But in any event, let's just talk about proof of work blockchain. We can use Bitcoin to represent that. For people who get confused by that, you're not going to make it anyway. So, all right, so let's take a look at it. We've talked about a bunch of characteristics. So one characteristic, oh, sorry, let me even go zoom back. So we looked at civilization. We noticed that civilization had two major structural elements. One was institutional forms, and the other was markets. And if we zoom in on Bitcoin, we notice it has both. And it's important that it has both. And I'll expand on that in a second. We notice,
yeah, it's an institutional form and a market. Yes.
Yeah. What are its institutional forms? Well, it has the construct of mining.
Yes.
Mining operates according to a series of agreements, in this case, coded into protocols. Yep. Right? So that's an institutional form. That's what it is. There's not many, but that's another piece. You've also got compact, minimum viable. Right? It is a well-designed system. It contains only the elements it needs. It contains those elements at an adequate level, like it actually has what it needs and no more. And then it is constructed. This is the hyperstructure concept. It's constructed in such a way that once it does what it does, it is self-contained, but it has no human control structures, the cultures that are able to begin to steer it. So it stays, to use the language of a guy named Carroll Quigley, he talks about the distinction between instruments and institutions. An instrument is something that acts as a functional tool to extend human agency. An institution is an instrument that has begun to take on its own agency and begins to have its own motivations. And so what you need is instruments like Bitcoin that do what they do. They do it at a level that is complete, and they have no agency, nor are they capturable to produce institutions out of them. Right? So I'm fine graining the language. Earlier I said it has institutions. Now I have to say it has instrumentalities. And those instrumentalities are designed in such a way that they can't become institutions and therefore can't become captured or corrupted. They just do what they do.
There's this strange, and there's so many ways where Bitcoin is like the unity of opposites that I won't go into, but this is a new one I've never thought of, that it is functioning as a very effective instrument to the individual, right? You're giving the individual one of the optimal means of preserving purchasing power across time and space, yep. What money is supposed to do. And in that, it's almost like a consensus cluster that forms the institution of Bitcoin, which is like the fixed supply of 21 million, for instance. Like it's every user voting, like which node they're going, which language they're going to run with their node.
Yep.
Forms this consensus cluster of 21 million fixed supply. So you get this institutional imposition of like fixed money supply, but it's emergent from the individual actions of the network participants.
Yep.
You get a weird like perfection of instrumentality and institution through it's almost like emanation and emergence coinciding. It's strange.
Nice. Yeah, nice. That's a good conceptual import. So then we had this problem of, do we have the ability to bind down, and do we have the ability to abstract up? And of course, again, we have something which may in fact be, I am proposing in fact that it is the most possible, and I mean that strongly, this is a logical argument, the most possible of both. In other words, proof of work binds all the way down to energy at the most basic level. And this includes things like permissionlessness.
Yeah.
Anybody anywhere can endeavor on their own basis with no constraints applied at all to
Yeah.
discover a source of energy that is cheaper than other sources of energy and therefore achieve a temporary local advantage in Bitcoin. Right. So there, if you invent free energy, awesome, you get to win.
Yes. Yes.
There's
Interesting
no
thing.
cultural downward causation on that.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. So I try not to interrupt much, but you're triggering so many amazing thoughts. That temporary local advantage you just cited, right? If you find cheaper energy, then you get a temporary local advantage in Bitcoin mining. But that local advantage is then disseminated into the world in the form of cheap energy.
Yep.
So that's another interesting kind of like global local alignment.
Yeah, this is very. Yeah, you nailed it. So global local alignment. So let's do. So you have energetic binding all the way down, and then you have the maximum abstraction. Right, it's defined by pure math. Right,
Yes.
pure math and pure computation. The computation is maximally abstract. Again, the fact that it's not solving any particular, call it utilitarian problem that culture can identify, but is solving a pure abstraction problem is critical. So
Yeah.
you have these 2 points at the maximum of abstraction on the basis of transcendence,
Right.
things that are invariant across human agency, and energy, which is also transcendent and fundamental to any. And remember, energy is fundamental to chemistry, laws of thermodynamics, is fundamental to biology, fitness, is fundamental to behavior. This is called behavioral investment theory. It's fundamental to culture. And then ultimately, okay, now we can say it's fundamental to this new thing, this technological civilization. But we can maintain the continuity all the way up. And it holds both, and you can't go higher, you can't go more abstract, and you can't go lower. And so you don't have the problem of gold and fiat moving here. You got the whole continuum, top to bottom, and connected properly. And then the global local binding, right? It creates a context where everybody's time preference produces a movement, a propagation out into a more global and a longer time preference. So we can all sort of look at it and say, oh, cool, do what you are doing with a maximum focus on your local self-interest in the timeframes that you value. And the system will propagate that out horizontally so that it produces a global net benefit. And by the way, these 2 points are connected. It only works if the local benefit is at the level of energy or at the level of computation. Right? Only those 2 points. Any advance at the level of computation propagates horizontally. Any advance at the level of energy propagates horizontally. And then those are the 2 substrates atop which all things are built. The ability to use intelligence to modulate energy. Everything else in the economy is a subset of those 2 things coming together.
Yeah.
And so it triangulates an abstract structure that fills the entire space. But it's abstract and it's minimalist, right? It doesn't try to populate anything else. It says, okay, what am I going to do? What am I going to give you as your instrumentalities, as your institutions? Well, I'm going to give you a ledger. So the ability to maintain state that has the ability to do things like disambiguate and verify provenance of movement of information through time, consensus. And by the way, initially I'm going to give you consensus about a very, very compact minimal state, which is which wallets have what numbers associated with them. But the point is that's the minimum substrate that allows a lot of other things to be built. The ability to actually say and people, my friends over at Canonic are writing words onto the blockchain because we want to be able to preserve truth and knowledge through time. We don't want to be able to move up into the delusional stage. And by grounding these things on the blockchain, we have the ability to tap into an Axis Mundi that is going to be stronger than any other human social institution, both in terms of energy and in terms of resilience. And so we can all point and say, okay, our consensus about the state of the blockchain also happens to carry with it consensus about an increasing concentric circle of information.
Yes.
And any civilization that has that has the advantage of being able to tap into the reciprocal learning rate of technology and knowledge transfer faster than anybody else. Oh, this is that article you sent me. He's tapping into that piece of it.
Yeah, I think so. I forgot the title of the article, but he's proposing that Bitcoin is a solution to a knowledge problem.
Yeah, the Popperian falsification problem.
There we go. And just what you were saying there, like I think about this a lot too, and it's an underappreciated aspect of Bitcoin that in a world where we have more and more of reality being captured with cameras and audio and all these other, pieces of equipment, that data now has a place of permanence, right? That it can, in theory, we trend towards like a permanent record of history in a way, but it could be a very real time kind of record, right? Video, audio, all the information that's being compiled on the internet can now live in this censorship resistant, unamendable kind of domain.
Yep.
And that's very interesting because then you don't get it. Presumably you would get a dynamic where, the winners don't rewrite history, as it said, right? What history is written by the winners? Like, well, that might change actually with the advent of Bitcoin and the internet.
Exactly. And it will, I would say. I would argue that it absolutely will, because, and this goes back to the point that the characteristics of the binding agent naturally propagate out to the characteristics of that which it binds. And so the characteristics of this particular binding agent include things like transparency, immutability, provenance, and here's the thing: if I step out of like say 10 human cultural groups or civilization groups, and I say, okay, I want to design a really, really generative, really, really effective human civilization group. By the way, the founding fathers did this. They stepped out and said, what does it look like? Well, it turns out that people telling the truth, people sharing information as they perceive it, including all of their biases and errors, but where that truth cannot be falsified, cannot be retroactively changed, and where it's transparent, everybody can see it, and where the chain of the evolution of our shared perspective, provenance, is maintained, is the best possible form of human collaboration. And this is the most powerful information processing or knowledge production collaborative from a design point of view that can be made. Oh, well, that's interesting. We happen to get that. That happens to be the intrinsic nature of what this particular thing, this hyperstructure, produces. We've talked about it has all, and by the way, we now have beautifully, and in some sense, sorry, I'm interrupting myself. In some sense, I have a little bit of frustration with the fact that I got involved in Bitcoin in 2010, and now 15 years later, it's still only a tiny fraction of what I thought it could and should be. But in another sense, the fact that it's the biggest bank in the history of history and it has not yet been broken into or corrupted from the top is really powerful proof that it is in fact immune to that. And there's the likelihood that we would have gotten to something like this and somebody wouldn't have just stolen it is like zero. It's close enough for building on.
Absolutely. An order of magnitude or more, the biggest honeypot in human history.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
The fastest growing asset in human history, and also the biggest bank. So that it has an extremely decorated track record
for doing for being the kind of thing that is not corruptible.
Yes.
And in its core, and we need to be very clear for those people who aren't thinking clearly, there's lots of things at the periphery. The periphery is not secure. MT Gox was an error condition at the edge. The fact that somebody can spoof your wallet is an error condition at the edge, but the core, which is where all this thing is held, is very, very battle tested.
Yes, the core consensus protocol is for all. It appears to be incorruptible. It has not been corrupted up until this point.
Yeah.
Businesses building on it, using it, those have been fully corrupted. Either they've Mt. Gox. That case is just now getting resolved, right? The bankruptcy court in Japan is still resolving it, which is 11 years later. So yes, it's Bitcoin. The network and protocol has been uncorrupted up until this point, but Bitcoin exchanges, businesses, etc., just like every other human institution, they've been widely corrupted.
Yes, and this is actually a feature, not a bug, because what we want is a core structure that has the design characteristics. It acts as a binding agent that are the minimum viable design characteristics that we need to produce stability for civilization. And then we want to allow a tremendous amount of experimentation to happen on top of that.
On the edges. Yes.
And so the fact that we have had this experimentation on the edges and the experimentation has proven to be faulty is not a,
Mhm.
a bug. That's how things move forward.
That's capitalism, basically, right? Like the
Yeah.
failures teach, the other entrepreneurs what not to do.
And reality is complicated. You
Yeah.
can't know what the right thing to do is just by thinking really hard. You got to go do it, and you'll be wrong
Right.
most of the time, but you'll be right a little bit, and everybody else gets to look at that right, and that propagates sideways. And so in the
Yes.
middle, I've
Exactly.
got computation, I've got energy, and then I've got learning in the middle. And learning where I've got a record of what happened and who did what to who and what the consequences were that is transparent and
Yes.
immutable is shocking. It's shocking
Right.
to imagine what happens when you can build on top of that. Um, and by the way, of course, we could talk about and should, because the other ancillary elements are my friend. Well, I don't particularly know him, so let's just talk about an individual who I still have of warm feelings for, Vitalik and his crew, when they were talking about Ethereum, in particular talking about smart contracts, right? Because that was kind of the essence, was we need to be able to do this, tap into the ability to build smart contracts or software on top of this blockchain. That's correct. And you can. There's no reason why you can't do that. And in fact, as we said, Bitcoin is actually a complex of a handful of core smart contracts, the mining contract being the dominant one, and the transmission contract. I mean, it's built around a set of software. And one can build inside of that or on top of that a variety of other ways of extending that, which allows us to do things like make agreements, but make agreements that are a different kind of agreement than the kind of agreements that civilization produces. Because civilization agreements, and this is, I'm definitely speaking to the choir here, code supersedes law.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? It
Yeah.
really does. When you can build agreements on the basis of code, you can have 100% certainty what will happen, and it cannot be corrupted.
You're taking the
Now,
human out of the loop.
and there are things upon which you'd like to do that.
Yes.
Oddly
Yeah.
enough, I was actually talking to some people who have been part of the Peterson Academy,
Mhm.
and they were disappointed because, unsurprisingly, it's been corrupted by human agency. And I was like, man, you could build that on crypto primitives where you could have all of the content uploading, the pricing, all of that could be constructed as smart contracts. And all of the corruption and failed human agency that you're decrying would be exited. Like once the design is done, everybody knows with certainty what they're agreeing to. The design might not be a great design. That's a different issue. But once the
Sure.
design is done, everybody knows what they're agreeing to. And by the way, since it's open and transparent, anybody else can propose an alternative to the design. And over a relatively short period of time, we will have sort of found the hyperstructure that resolves the problem of how do people create content, pedagogical content? How do people find the pedagogical content they'd like to get? And maybe some ancillary economies around that, like credentialization, et cetera. Okay, cool. So we can replicate a very large, and that, this is the notion of academy, which is a pretty big academy. Not difficult, ultimately, conceptually. Obviously, practice is harder than thinking about it, but not even at the end of the day, that hard in magnitude. This is much easier than SpaceX. To replicate or build something that replaces the academy on the basis of this new substrate, and would do it in a fashion which is vastly better. Because of the primitives, in this case, like provenance and immutability.
One of my highest health priorities is keeping my brain in top shape. To take care of my brain power, I do many things, such as striving to read, write, exercise, and meditate daily. One of the latest tools in my brain power toolkit is MindLab Pro. MindLab Pro is a nootropic supplement that is scientifically proven to enhance your brain power. When I take MindLab Pro, my mind feels like it has a better grip on the world, my thinking is more lucid, and the articulation of my speech is radically improved. MindLab Pro has been tested in rigorous, double-blind, placebo-controlled human trials and has been proven to enhance brain power for users in every age group. MindLab Pro is an advanced formulation of 11 nootropic ingredients and is backed by research from over 1,400 human trials conducted over the past 32 years. So if you're looking to enhance your brain power, MindLab Pro is an excellent solution. Go to mindlabpro.com/breedlove to start enhancing your brain power today. Again, that's mindlabpro.com/breedlove. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably get it. You get that Bitcoin upends everything that state-sponsored schools teach us about money. For those who get the importance of Bitcoin, it is important that we have a smart way to buy and hold Bitcoin. My friends at Coinbits, the oldest Bitcoin-only exchange in the United States, have pioneered the concept of roundups, which converts your spare change into Bitcoin. Simply connect your credit or debit cards, and your usual purchases are rounded up to the nearest dollar, letting you stack sats on every purchase without even thinking about it. Coinbits also provides a terrific self-custody experience. Connect a hardware wallet for automatic withdrawals into cold storage to minimize your risk and stay sovereign over your Bitcoin. My favorite Coinbits feature is Coinbits Plus, which gives you the best exchange rate on Bitcoin. It even gives you real-time feedback on how well you are doing on your savings plan. With Coinbits Plus, power users can save more money to buy even more Bitcoin. All that, plus peer-to-peer cash and Bitcoin payments, target orders, price alerts, and more means Coinbits can help you do almost anything you need to do with Bitcoin. So go to coinbits.app/breedlove to sign up today. Again, that is Coinbits, BITS.app/breedlove.
I do want to do like a small recap of the things we talked about and then ask you a question that might be kind of leading into the next phase. So you let me know if I should do that now or...
Yeah. I was about to do that actually myself, so
okay,
go for it.
Okay. I'll make an attempt here and then please just correct me where I've missed anything. So we have, I guess let's speak, well, there's this process of unfolding, first of all, as you described, right? We got to have an inorganic leading to an organic, leading to a social, leading to an intellectual. Use slightly different language, but that's how I interpreted it. Each fractal layer is kind of operating on the same principles to some extent, although you're getting a remix basically. So every layer is different, yet some operating with similar principles. The transition from the inorganic, from the organic to the social, we could perhaps mark at the Upper Paleolithic era with the emergence of art.
No, that's from the social to the cultural.
From the social to the cultural, sorry.
Yeah.
And then that lets us break the Dunbar number in terms of organization that we get.
No, that limits us to the Dunbar number. So that allows us to do something we can generalize from physical social organisms like packs of wolves, who are, by the way, also very limited in scale. Yeah. We can generalize to cultural organisms that no longer are bound to our physical kind. All of the like fur is now a cultural architecture. We can move more into software,
right?
But highly contextualized, so limited to Dunbar.
Okay. So I was thinking, is it not the advent of symbol with the emergence of art that lets us become these cultural organisms, that lets us organize into...
And more or less. I mean, there's a lot going on, but you can definitely put symbol as the name for that moment. So moving from communications to symbolic systems is the flip. Communication suddenly unlocks the symbolic and produces culture.
Got it. And I'm inspired by Hayek here, but he says that language, natural language, specifically law and money, are the three primary languages or binding agents, whatever you want to call it, of civilization proper.
Yeah.
And you brought up the point of like phenotypic bounding, but this lets us also transcend that once we get into a world with language, law, and money. You know,
well, I want to be careful. So there's two steps. Hayek combines two steps, and specifically what I'm doing is I'm saying there are two steps. I'm separating them out.
Yeah.
So the first step is natural language. And natural language moves us from the phenotypic to the cultural. And this produces the proto. I'm just gonna be very careful. Proto law, proto money. So think about money here as relationships of debt stored at Dunbar scale. Yeah. And law, relationships of systems of justification, what is right and wrong, also stored largely at the Dunbar scale. So it's held in kind of a human computer of 150 people, all speaking the same language. Right? So that gives us cultural organisms. But because these things are proto, we then run into a moment where there's a desire to scale beyond Dunbar. And by the way, Dunbar gets up to 15,000 if you include different ways of doing it. This moves us into the stage of technological civilization. where we begin to exact capabilities of money and exact capabilities of law and begin to build and move more and more operations into the decontextualized symbolic.
Got it.
And that is the story of civilization.
And then we get to sort of universals like gold or constitutional republics, like these more idealized forms, right?
Yeah.
Um,
and just to be clear, we just a simple version is we're now on this sort of exploratory map of different variations on these themes. And so we'll get Sumeria and we'll get Rome and we'll get the Han Dynasty, and each one has different variations on money and law.
Yes. Yes.
But they're all variations on money and law.
Right. Yeah, and then it's almost like every meta step is like a distillation of the layer below. So like we take all the learnings across all these different experiments of individuals, cultures, et cetera, and then we're abstracting out what worked broadly speaking across all of them. So I think of something like private property, right? The fact that individualized private property emerged over time, that was a really useful social institution, whatever we want to call this, that was applicable to the success of a wide range of these groups across time. And so you're getting like a data compression, I guess, or at
Something
least
like that. Yeah.
installation over time. And so, I'm going back now to, well, I want to ask you about this. Maybe this is the transition point, because the price signal is so important in the coordination of markets. And that too is a massive data compression technology, for lack of a better term. So if there is for instance, if the price, the prototypical example I always use, if the price of copper goes up, no market participant in the market for copper needs to know that there was an earthquake in Chile that, collapsed a mine and disrupted the flow of copper to the market. They just need to see number go up. And now as a producer, you're incentivized to produce more. As a consumer, you're incentivized to consume less or use substitutes. And through that coordination signal, we resolve the issue of reduced supply flow of copper to the marketplace. So what am I asking here? It's like, what is the role of data compression broadly? And then what is the role of price signaling in the coordination of markets? And then when we start to debase the money, obviously we distort the price signal. So again, we are dissolving the binding agent to some extent.
Yeah.
So how do we think about these things? And sorry to throw a lot at you.
All right. So data compression we can think of in two ways. And I think actually a useful way of thinking about it is the term embodiment. So think about it like when you're building a physical skill. Let's just use like riding a bike. So for a while, you're riding a bike in the software layer, which is very ineffective, and you don't do it well. Pardon me, because it has a lot of complex subtleties. And there's a lot of stuff going on when you're trying to figure out how to ride a bike, but your body can do it. At a certain point, you have embodied it, meaning the skill of riding a bike is moved from a thing that you're running in software to something that is now being running in your local hardware, which then means it's
conscious.
Yeah, from the conscious to the unconscious, and it's now a substrate upon which you can do other stuff. Right? You can ride a bike while standing up. You can read a book while riding a bike. You can talk to your friends while riding a bike. You can pop a wheel. Like you can add more stuff on top of the substrate. And the process of data compression in this sense, right? Because the point is, it's not compression generically. It is the very, very subtle collection of finding the parts that matter and the relationships that matter and combining them into a compact, minimum viable, complete set. And this is true for all things that are embodied. When you're learning how to read, when you're learning how to juggle, when you're learning how to type, what you're doing is you're saying, okay, this movement of my hand is not useful for typing, so I'm going to compress that out. This is useful, but only in this, like you're taking a huge space and you're selecting the subset that matters until it's got all that it needs, and then it's a hyperstructure. Right. Then it doesn't change a whole lot. It's solid. You might change it a little bit at the edge because you notice you need to do a fork because something. But that's the idea. So this notion of an exploratory expansion into a very complex space that is, by the way, the word is liminal. You don't understand how it works. Encounter with reality until the shape of that space has been identified. Then the collapse or the reification of that space into a complete, compact, energetically efficient, minimal amount of overhead, and then it's concretization, its embodiment into a hyperstructure that now becomes a substrate for the rest of us to build on top of. I kind of like this way of thinking about it because it helps us understand that when I say hyperstructure in digital space, I also mean the same thing as hyperstructure in physical embodiment space. And what we're saying is proof of work blockchain allows us to embody the reified subset of characteristics of law and markets that we actually have identified as being necessary, upon which we can now make that as hyperstructure, next level.
That's a great point because law and money and natural, these things too become embodied to some extent, right? You don't think about each word before you use it. You don't think about the nature of money when you go and transact in it. You don't think about even the institution. It's kind of giving you a template, I guess, that you can just fill. And the active embodiment, you're entraining the physical movement without needing to involve that software layer. So the software layer is free to focus on other novel problems that haven't yet been codified, automized, and automatized, made automated, and embodied.
Yeah.
You have your consciousness to focus on novelty, and then whereas you encode the patterns that you've already acquired unconsciously so that they can be done in a very economically efficient way.
Yep. Because again, well, let's just use the example. So now we're going to talk about the price function. The analogy that fits very nicely for the price function is the transition from biology to behavior, to what becomes ultimately animals, and then eventually becomes social organisms. The thing that lived at that transition point is neurology, the nervous system. So just think about like a plant. The leaf can close, it can open, it can rotate towards the sun. Like it can engage in a small number of changes in relationship to its context. And then you think about an animal. An animal could do a whole bunch of stuff in relationship to its environment. The transition between those two is the specialized cell called the neuron, and then the connection of neurons. And by the way, the complete reorganization of morphology into relatively distinct organs that are coordinated by means of neurons. So a plant doesn't operate that way. Plant doesn't have the ability for pieces of the plant to be communicated at lightning speed with binary on-off switches to be able to activate a whole portfolio of behaviors. It has to have like this large systemic percolation of chemical gradients, which is informationally poor and slow. And so that's that movement from plant to animal. Is neurology gets in the middle. Neurology is optimized. Neurons are dialed in, and then neurons start to connect to other neurons and create nervous systems. And then you've moved into animals, and animals then can unlock whole portfolio of behaviors, which is a completely different category of possibility than what happens with plants. The market is a nervous system coordinating a diversity of humans. So once you get the ability to use this very particular kind of communications medium, money, and the underlying characteristics of what causes money to move in very particular ways, right? There's a reason why it's narrow. The price signal only has two directions, up and down. It has a vector, up fast, down fast, but that's it, right? It's very narrow in how it can communicate, but it's very broad in the speed and the diversity. Right? It can communicate all prices. It can communicate all prices in principle across all market participants, and it can do so very, very rapidly. And so this, of course, enables the coordination of humans in a fashion which is completely different than the coordination structures that are enabled by systems of justification, Dunbar scale. In all ways, right? If I tried to communicate, this is what happens in corporations, actually. Corporations are operating at basically Dunbar constraints. And I try to communicate to you, hey, this is a good idea. You should do it. We're using the technology of culture, systems of justification, to try to coordinate our behavior. And I have to do things like give you good reasons. And I have to be able to give you evidence that my vision of reality is both true and honest, and that my visions of right choice are efficient. That's a lot of work. And we can get coordinated. Cultures are effective, but the price signal allows certain kinds of coordination, not all of them, certain kinds of coordination to be wildly scalable, and very, very rapid. And that's very equivalent to the nervous system. Right? The nervous system doesn't have content. The nervous system doesn't know whether you should go towards or away from the thing, but it does give you a signal that's hot, and then that opens up into an evolutionary structure of saying, okay, well, that which goes towards hot dies, that which goes away from hot lives. Okay, we're all going to go away. when hot is on, but the nervous system just gives you the signal. So now, of course, this is the problem of where we are, because we've been moving from the proto market at the cultural level into exploring what I'm just going to now call the infant or toddler market that we've been in for the past 5,000 years or so, into hopefully what becomes a mature market. And the error condition is very similar, by the way, to somebody who takes cocaine. I can trick my nervous system. I can take cocaine and suddenly I've got such a rush of dopamine that I think I've got tiger blood and I'm winning. The nervous system only has a certain limited capability of interfacing with actual reality, and the ability to either get in front of it with false signal or get into it and hijack the signal. In other words, I can debase the currency and I can hijack the signal so that everybody thinks that I'm the one who should be making choices because I've got numbers and the numbers are no longer grounded in reality. But if I can produce a form of signal which can't be hijacked on the inside and can't be hijacked on the outside, if it's not producing more energy, then it's not working. Then I get to something like a mature market, and then we can sit on top of this substrate in just the same way that animals sit on top of a nervous system.
That's fantastic. So each market actor in this analogy is a neuron in the global economy, something like that.
Both a neuron and a muscle.
Neuron and a muscle, right? Okay.
Yeah.
That's so it's the something about complex adaptive systems are very dependent on the integrity of their communication systems. And if those communication systems break down, then the complex adaptive system becomes chaotic, basically.
Yeah.
I want to touch on something there because you talked about this transition from a toddler economy to like a mature economy. We actually had this sort of realization the other day on a phone call that I do with a group of men that I lead retreats for. They made the connection in our conversation. We made the connection between maturity and time preference, and we were drawing on the marshmallow experiment, which you've probably heard of, right?
Sure.
The kids offered one marshmallow now or two marshmallows later, and the kids that chose two marshmallows later reliably showed better outcomes in life later, right? They had like a lower time preference, so they were. You probably know better than I, but they excelled the kids that chose the one marshmallow across a number of domains, studied across a number of years. And so do you think shifting from the toddler economy to the mature economy is a matter of getting civilizational time preference to decline? Like, should that be the metric that we're focused on? And then in economics, this is where we're kind of really in a screwed place, because the interest rate is the price signal that reflects the social appraisal of time preference. Right now, we live in a world where interest rates are centrally planned, right? There's not even free market price discovery on the interest rate because we have central banks all over the world. So are we disabling our ability to progress in terms of economic maturity because of the central planning of money?
So what I would say is that it's not linear. It's not simple. So maturity is not, strictly speaking, bound to simple time preference. Rather, maturity is an increase in the portfolio of your time preferences and the sensitivity of the matching of your time preferences to the reality of the context in which you live. So, for example, if your hair's on fire, you should immediately, with no waiting, put it out. Okay. If, on the other hand, you've planted seeds recently, you should wait until they have in fact germinated and grown and born seed that can be harvested for planting more seeds. Yeah. So mapping your time preference to the context that you're in, and this involves a combination of being able to perceive reality clearly. A lot of maturity is being able to just be with what really is. It's weird to say that, but we bullshit ourselves radically.
Yes.
And maturity is the careful ability to not bullshit yourself on one side.
Yeah.
And then the second is the entraining of all the diversity of your desires so that your desires have a proper telos and they have a proper purpose. And it's how do I say it right? There's three versions of these things. One, of course, is chaos, where you're just driven by your desires and the loudest desire yanks you towards it, which tends to be short-term desires tend to be very loud.
Like a 3-year-old.
Like a 3-year-old. Give me yeah. Second is tyranny. Tyranny is where some kind of purpose imposes itself as the telos. You could also call this idolatry, by the way, and it subordinates all the others, but it does so in a fashion which is very fragile, meaning they're all still yelling and trying to demand. If at any point that tyranny breaks down, you will collapse rapidly. The last version is maturity, right? In maturity, you have actually identified a proper telos, and that telos has, in fact, carefully integrated all of your desires in a fashion where they're not fighting with each other, but are increasingly orienting towards collaborative movement. So you can think like, okay, I need to plant the seeds. I need to let the seeds grow. I need to wait until the seeds have, the plant has germinated enough seeds that I can harvest them and plant again the next season. And I'm going to be thoughtful about, how hungry am I? I'm integrating the fact that my hunger is a signal that's valid and real. I'm not ignoring it. I'm noticing it, but I'm also putting it in a particular place. Like you can actually bring all of these elements into a coherent, well-integrated whole. So I've got being with reality on this side and a well-integrated whole of my desires and motivations and intents towards a telos. And by the way, that telos has to be a telos which is itself grounded in reality. If my telos does not lead me back to actually producing more food, I've just extinguished myself. That's maturity.
Right. Okay. And that telos, if it's aimed at, this is where time preference, I think, connects again. It's if you're aimed at a more distant vision of yourself, then you're actually going to make decisions that allow you to create more compounding effects towards creating that outcome. Basically,
you sure will.
Yeah.
You absolutely will.
Okay.
Because reality is complex and you don't understand it very well.
Yeah, and the being in touch with reality too. That also gets back to your price signals, right? If you don't have clear price signals, well, you're not in touch with reality, right? I don't. If when the price goes up, if it's a distorted price signal, I don't know if it's actual supply and demand changes or if it's policy changes.
Oh, it's brutal. Yeah. It's wow. It's horrifying actually. This is one of the things that concerns me at a medium level, because obviously there are a lot bigger things in the world, but the stupidity of the economics profession with regard to the nature of what money is, the analogy to neurology, the price signal as a coordination structure. I mean, it shocks me. Like the notion that they can make an argument that because the accounts in a ledger balance out, that the monetary system is functional. It actually, how do I say it right? It actually is shocking. Like I'm baffled, and I'm trying to think like what's an analogy. It'd be like if somebody ran face first into a window, and because they did not in fact break their face, they decided that was a perfectly functional behavior. You'd be like, no, not breaking your face is definitely a nice thing, but you're off. You're like completely insane. You're completely irrational. So anyway, that's a bit of an aside, but you're right.
No. A deep mistaking of map and territory again, right? Like, oh, if GDP or whatever the metric is in line with their expectation, and they think the actual complex economy is healthy.
Yeah.
I'm reading a book. This is recommended by Vervaeke, The Blind Spot, and it talks about that very thing across a number of domains, where like mistaken model for reality in so many different scientific domains.
Yeah, and we could just say like that category, that characteristic is an endemic portion of what can happen when you move into symbolism.
Yes.
And then if you don't have built-in feedback loops that reground you in reality, you will get stuck in bullshit. It just is. It's something we can't avoid.
Yes. The idea that knowledge can be total leads to the totalitarian mindset. You lose actually faith, which I would define as like an act of openness to the unknown. So the decline in faith, the rise in totalitarianism leads to all these bad outcomes, both internally, like again, as you said, you can be kind of a totalitarian or tyrant to yourself, but also collectively we have these things as well.
So do we want to bridge to states without nations?
Yeah. So I was gonna. Yeah, if you want to go there, the next thing I wanted to ask you about was I was going to read the sovereign individual thesis summary points, which are on page 5 of the outline I sent you, and just ask about the parallels to your thesis. But we can go there whenever you're ready.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so I'll quickly read this. Listeners to this show are probably familiar with this book. I've talked about it quite a bit. These are bullet points that an LLM helped me generate quickly, so we can just like hit the main thesis points, and then I wanted to throw it over to you because this was in the end of strategy, but perhaps other places that you've written or spoken about this, but there seem to be a lot of parallels between your thinking and this book. So the summary points are as follows. The nation state arose during the industrial age to manage centralized economies, enforce taxation, and mobilize mass resources. Information technology now enables individuals to move ideas, labor, and capital across borders, which weakens state control. Digital money, i.e., Bitcoin, allows people to store and transfer wealth outside the state's reach, which erodes its ability to tax and survey. This shift empowers individuals to become sovereign, choosing jurisdictions and forming digital or low tax communities. As their fiscal power declines, many nation states will collapse or transform into competitive, service-oriented entities. The transition will likely be chaotic, marked by resistance from elites and social disruption as new systems emerge. Yeah, I mean, the way again, this is the LLM framing. The way I typically frame it is once people have recourse to a monetary policy that does not victimize them, basically, you're not stealing their purchasing power through inflation, that people will eventually all necessarily wake up to and opt into that monetary policy.
Mm-hmm.
Because it is, when you look at the effects over time, it's, if you can save, say, 10% in taxation, it's not just the 10% you're saving that year, it compounds year over year. But what also compounds is the additional yield you would get on those assets, right? So the 10% you save would probably also generate a 5% yield or whatever it is. And so when you look at this over like 40-year working histories, the decision to opt out of predatory fiat currency monetary policy and into favorable Bitcoin monetary policy is in like the tens of millions of dollars for even someone that's just like middle of the road income earner.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this like osmotic economic pressure that pushes people out of fiat currencies into Bitcoin. And this is a very core piece to the Bitcoin thesis. But attached to this thesis is this whole dissolution of the nation state, because, well, how are they going to generate revenue? If inflation's roughly 50% of nation state revenue, if that goes away, well, then presumably nation states have to shrink by at least 50% over time.
Yeah, there's a bunch. There's a whole lot. So let me see. I agree with the diagnosis and with, to meaningful extent, the prognosis up to a certain threshold. I disagree with the primitives that they are operating on as their theoretical basis. From my point of view, they're actually importing liberalism as primitives. And I think that's actually, theoretically limiting. It causes conclusions that I don't think are correct and historically incorrect, which is to say that we are exiting that moment, not continuing that moment under another form. Caveat, but very oddly, particularly Bitcoin being a big piece of this third path. So let's see. One, there's a diversity of things that are conspiring to break the power and necessity of the state. And that last word is really critical. For example, it actually has historically been very difficult to maintain a monetary system without a state. Apropos. People with guns take your money. Okay, I need something. Shit, now I've got a state. Well, crap. Now that I've got a state, I've got people who are going to use that state against me. Oh, too bad. This is, Saul.
Right, so.
Well, shoot. It is, in fact, the case that money doesn't belong in the state. This is very important. Like at a theoretic level, money is a commons in the same way that language is a commons, right? Yeah. Money does not belong to the state.
Right.
And putting it in the state immediately perverts it into something that will fail in a number of bad ways. Okay. With Bitcoin, uniquely in history, we don't need the state because the symmetry of power has changed. And in fact, Bitcoin is strong enough that even the state cannot coercively impose itself. So you've got two. I don't need the state because I no longer have to worry, because it's hyper abstract. I don't have to worry about the characteristics of what happened with the commodity money. And the state cannot pose itself upon me, so I don't need to worry about the characteristics of what happens with fiat money. And so the natural equilibrium, you could just use a physics argument. I've kind of removed two forces that are pulling us out of equilibrium. Once I've removed them, the equilibrium just settles back into the commons. The money will settle, and people, just like people remembering the cultural memory of gold, they'll drift back into this location. So there's a lot of arguments for why that's the case. And then the next piece is to say, and the state is the ability to artificially, inappropriately commandeer money is load bearing for the construct known as the state. Right? A state that cannot steal money from the commons won't hold together. It can't function properly. It can't function. So the fact that it is no longer necessary nor can be imposed means that we will begin to see the unwinding of the state. Now, that's on the money side. We also have the law side. Well, we're going to see the same thing. As long as if we can enter into agreements and those agreements can be enforced at a meaningful level. By the way, it doesn't need to be exhaustively on the basis like if 60% of activity can be governed by code, then again, the state is not relevant. And that other 40%, we can figure that shit out. That's not heavy lifting. And by the way, that has been the case. If you look at the Exodus story, the Israel from Egypt all the way through to Saul operated without a state. It was operating as tribes, nations, and they had adjudication, they had judgment, and the judgment was locally enforced. You didn't have to listen to Samuel. You should, but you didn't have to. It was not enforced by virtue of physical coercion. It was enforced by the fact that wisdom meant that if you didn't do the wise thing, then you were going to get, killed by the Hittites or whoever. So these are the two pieces. And so what happens is this new substrate, this new embodiment of a hyperstructure removes both the need and the ability to impose the state upon peoples. And this leads to the movement towards now the nation without a state. Okay, now, so let me clarify some concepts. Sovereign and individual, two words. And this is the reason why I think it's critical. They've unfortunately imported inverted understandings of both terms. They imported individual when what we really want is persons. We've discussed that before.
Yep.
Individuals cannot be sovereign because the nature of to have become individual is to have had your personhood subordinated to a structure outside of you that decontextualizes you and enmeshes you in its architecture. That's what individual is. So you're by definition not sovereign. Now what happens is because our consciousness, particularly in the West, has emerged in the context of liberalism, we've identified sovereignty as being a relatively limited degree of tyranny. This is really critical. Right? We've identified sovereignty as less tyranny. Okay, I don't have to do what the king tells me. I have more relative freedom of action. This is, to use a Nietzschean sensibility, this is kind of like the slave mentality. Right? The slave perceives not being a slave as freedom. That's not freedom. Right? It's the absence of tyranny, but the absence of tyranny isn't freedom. Sovereignty is like maturity. You're not born sovereign. You're born capable of becoming increasingly sovereign in relationship with a larger scope of reality. That's really critical. Think of sovereignty as a developmental capacity. You are born with the capacity to increase your level of sovereignty in relationship with a more and more complex and intense reality. And a very simple example. I do not know how to ride a skateboard. With regard to the context of skateboarding, I am not sovereign, meaning I cannot make choices that are effective and live in accordance with my choices in relationship with this context. I will think in my mind, I want to stand on that skateboard and roll forward and do something fun. Instead, I will fall on my ass and probably break my tailbone. I am not sovereign. I cannot live in relationship with reality in accordance with my choices and make effective choices, by the way. These are two distinct elements that are intertwined. But if I practice, I could developmentally achieve an increasing capacity to make more and more effective choices in relationship with that context. I'm becoming more and more sovereign. Now just integrate that across the totality of all possible contexts and all possible choices. Sovereignty is an infinitely large combinatorial explosion of possibilities. It is not merely the absence of somebody bigger than you telling you what to do. Right? It's the inverse of that.
Only independent.
Yes, it is context. Context is relevant. Now, I can look back and notice that if I increase, say, wisdom or intelligence or perception, increase courage. It's a very large number of things that will generically increase my capacity to develop sovereignty in a wide variety of contexts. So that's true. And I might accidentally reify and say, oh, that's sovereignty, but they're not. They're sovereignty catalysts. They're support. Sovereignty is an infinite expanse, and sovereignty is grounded in personhood. Persons have the imago Dei, by the way. Persons have the capacity to cultivate an increasing relationship with the diversity of contexts and intensity of contexts, and therefore increase their sovereignty, their relative sovereignty. So what happens is I take the word sovereign individual and I elide it over to, let's go with lowercase s, lowercase I, or no, lowercase s, capital I, sovereign individual, and I shift it, capital S, capital P, sovereign persons. And notice, by the way, sovereign persons are not governed by independence. They're governed by relationships. Persons are relational intrinsically, right? An individual is somehow weirdly, perversely identified by lack of relationality, by independence, because of course they're a slave, right? Mentally, their idea of relationship is a relationship of tyranny. So I want to be freed of that relationship. But what man is not born a slave, right? You're born a person, where relationships are relationships of love and care and intimacy and richness and nuance and meaning. And that's the core of personhood. That is what persons do vis-a-vis each other. And by the way, is the whole point of sovereignty. We enter into sovereignty not to be able to tell tyrants no. We enter into sovereignty in order to explode the possibilities of relationships that we can have with other persons. And that's what the divine economy is. If you sort of want to distinguish, you've kind of got the perverse economy, which is independent individuals quasi-coordinating in order to achieve something like separate local wealth. And the divine economy is persons in intimate relationships collaborating in order to radically increase individual and collective sovereignty, which is to say true wealth, which is to say meaning, or a bigger, higher telos.
That's beautiful. I think the reframing from individual to persons is critical. As someone who's espoused the value of the individual for many, many years now, I think I'm going to have to adopt that language.
This, by the way, landed on me by a friend of mine from church only about 2 months ago. And I had the exact experience of like, whoa, that's big.
That is so important. And then, you ultimately want, I think the ideal world is where you have these sovereign persons honoring the life, liberty, and property of every other sovereign person.
Well, they sure do, don't they? I mean, think about that. Yeah. It's obvious, isn't it?
Yeah, it's simple. It's very simple, but then we're always dealing with, I guess, the dark side, right? That there's always this temptation to profit from coercion. And so the best thing we can do is make coercion as unprofitable as possible.
That's right. And it's this is not useless. It's very useful to say, hey, we want to make coercion not just unprofitable, but extinguished.
Yeah.
So let's think about it, but we don't censor that as the essence of reality.
Yeah.
This is the essence of reality, and this is a useful thing we need to think about.
Yes. So to extinguish, and I don't know, like extinguish is the ideal. I don't know if that would ever be possible, but if you could at least reduce the financial incentives to it, and then also create a moral code that condemns it, which we've made a lot of headway on the moral code, even on the incentives too. But Bitcoin seems to be like another giant leap forward in the incentives, at least.
Massively. And also the structural element. I think we should never underestimate the degree to which Bitcoin makes a wide variety of forms of coercion, most notably large-scale war, maybe even impossible.
Yeah.
It's very important to notice the degree to which fiat is connected to large-scale war.
Yes. And again, we could loosely define statism as institutionalized coercion. So that's another reason why Bitcoin is so diminishing to the state, basically, to make activity less economically viable. Okay, I want to shift gears one more time. And I want to go, because we don't have a ton of time left, but I wanted to talk, I'm very curious about Christ in Revelations. He comes back and, confronts and destroys, corrupts nations and worldly powers. There's a lot, we could talk about the specifics here. His eyes are like flames of fire. He wears many crowns, which is supposed to indicate supreme authority over all kings and nations. His robe is dipped in blood, which signifies perhaps either his own sacrifice or the coming judgment. And he is called the Word of God, which links him to divine authority, from the beginning. And there's a lot of people in Bitcoin that have used the Immaculate Conception of Christ as kind of a metaphoric connection to the emergence of Bitcoin. And I'll read one. This is from my friend Brian Estes, and he just put it like this. He made a list. He goes, how is Bitcoin like Jesus? 1, there's an Immaculate Conception. 2, it's a gift to the world. 3, loves everybody, lives forever, hated by the establishment, brings peace, flips the money changers' tables. It's a central source of truth. It's moral, and it started a revolution. And then I went on, I responded to his tweet and added a few more. I said it brought a moral software update for human hearts. It's ushering humanity into a higher echelon civilization. It's inspiring righteousness, honesty, and growth and adherence to the code. It's alignment of word and deed, perfect integrity, and gave us freedom so that we may be free. Now, that is going to sound like some super cultish religious nonsense to most non-Bitcoiners, but there are these deep connections between ideological structure. I guess we're talking about ideological structures broadly when we talk about religion, money, natural language, law. These are all constructs we have created. And so there does seem to be this kind of singular moment in history. Obviously, when Christ was born and was crucified were 2 of those singular moments, but I hope it's not too far afield to say it seems like Bitcoin is at least on that same, I don't want to put it above, but it's in that same wheelhouse, maybe. Like a pre-Bitcoin, post-Bitcoin world we're talking about. If all of these things we've been pontificating about are even 10% true, that would be a pretty radical change to the world.
Yeah, I have to laugh on the basis of the fact that I am in fact arguing that Bitcoin is at that order, near that order of magnitude, like exactly 1 step below.
Yes.
Like exactly 1 step, not 3 steps, not the same, but 1 step below.
Yes. And I know you're, correct me where I'm wrong. As I understand it, you're a recently converted Christian. And people often think that I'm Christian because I talk about these things a lot. I designate myself as a disciple of Christ. It's like I consider him a very imitation-worthy individual and person. And I'm not to say that he's not also God or whatever, but I don't like the expectations that come with declaring myself a Christian. So I haven't felt comfortable enough to call myself that yet. Mm-hmm. But I take Christ very seriously. Like I try to internalize him as a role model to increase my own achievement of my aspirational goals, basically. So I don't know. I shared all that with you.
Well, let me just give you one piece of a twist that just landed on me, and then we'll go back to what we were just talking about. So remember in Gethsemane, he very specifically points out the Father's will, not his will.
Yes.
So as a role model, the primary message he gives you is to not further your aspirational goals, but to further the Father's aspirational goals, even if those seem extremely bad to you. So I will leave that with you.
Yeah, and I yes, valid correction, and that's what I was trying to invoke with aspirational, is like to try and be a better person, do the right thing, grow. Yeah, God's will be done, not my own, basically.
There you go. Yeah. So if by aspiration that's what you mean, then there's nothing that I withdraw what I said. I just misunderstood. So first, with regard to the previous argument or point, we need to talk about how analogies work. Because in some sense, everything is like everything else. And in some sense, everything is unlike everything else. So we can always do a comparison, and our comparison will always be somewhat accurate and somewhat wrong. Fair enough, right? So if anybody categorically has trouble with saying Bitcoin is like Jesus, then they're just not thinking about how analogies work. I do not believe that you're saying that Bitcoin is in fact actually Jesus. That would be a different assertion.
Correct.
But if you're saying, hey, let's do a comparison, and in doing our comparison, now the question is, okay, well, is this comparison helpful? Why we spend our time on doing a comparison. I can say, okay, a mountain is like a tree. Okay, cool. A mountain's not like a tree in lots of ways. If I'm trying to climb a mountain, it's not the same as climbing a tree. Shoot, my comparison's not helpful. Well, a mountain's like a tree in the sense that it has verticality and there's a top, and the top is different from the bottom, and the bottom has to be thick to, oh, okay, that's useful. A house is like a mountain. Oh, okay, right? Like, where's it useful? So where's it useful? Good question. Um, well, I'm going to go hard theology on this, if you don't mind.
Please.
Because remember, the Christ is the second person of the Trinity. This is important. We said persons. He is a person, and he's one of three persons that are in the Trinity. And the second person of the Trinity is the Logos. And the Logos is incarnation. And so everywhere you hear about incarnation, any theophany, the burning bush, the angel of the Lord, the word of the Lord, these are all the second person, the incarnation, the manifestation of heaven and earth. The word made flesh is Christ. The word embodied in some fashion is the second person of the Trinity.
Okay.
I'm making that distinction just to make it clear. So Jesus Christ is the incarnation of the word made flesh as a human being. The burning bush is the incarnation of the word made bush as a burning bush. Same guy, same person.
Right.
Okay. What the Logos does is the Logos brings heaven and earth together. This is sometimes known as it brings God and man together, right? It allows analogy, analogos. The Logos allows things to be brought together into a quality of relationship. Now, many of the things that we've been discussing around Bitcoin at a very deep level, like this notion of bringing pure abstract computation and pure energy into a proper relationship, that is the Logos.
Right.
Bringing these two qualities, bringing heaven, pure idea, and earth, pure energy, into a relationship that is strong. That is the word of God. That is what the Logos is, and that is what the Logos does. It's what it affords. Same thing. Let's talk about how we want to relate. How did you say it earlier? Morality and structure. How did you describe it before? We want to create system design, a monetary system design, that the design of the system eliminates or downregulates a wide variety of behaviors and upregulates a wide variety of behaviors. So that's a design system.
Yeah, I think it said material incentives or the profitability of coercion. And then there's also the moral side
and
of
the
it.
moral structure, right? Two versions of the same basic idea, right? There's a symmetry here. The word of God here and the kind of the word of God here. This is the grammar of expression, and this is the content of expression. And again, Logos brings them together. All right, now you notice that I am speaking to you, and you can understand that I'm saying something, and it means something to you. That's the word of God. That's the Logos. The Logos enables the structure of speech, the fact that I'm saying certain words, not other words, and I'm modulating the muscles of my mouth to produce certain kinds of sounds that your ear can discern from ambient noise and compress that down into words. And then your mind somehow is able to actually then orient towards meaning in the abstraction. And this enables us to coordinate and connect. That's the Logos.
Could we call it pure relationality? Like, is that another term for it? That it's the relationality of all things. That Logos is the binding agent of the whole thing, right?
No. The Trinity is pure relationality. The Logos is actualized relationality.
Got it. Okay.
So the fact that two things are actually brought into relationship, the actuality of it, that's the Logos. The fact that they can be brought into relationship, that's the Trinity.
Trinity. Okay. Got it.
And now we notice that we had this conversation about reality and telos. That's really nice. In the context of telos, what we want to do is we want to orient ourselves aspirationally in the direction of the highest possible telos. And we just discussed that's the will of the Father. So we can grab that. And then we have reality, which is we want to have a clear, true, non-bullshit relationship with what really is, so that we can then orient ourselves towards the will of the Father. So now what I have is sort of, this is, by the way, probably the whole Trinity. I probably have the will of the Father is the pure telos. The reality with which I'm in relationship is the spirit, the energy. Sometimes we would say the divine energies, and then the logos is what brings these two things into actual relationality, into the field. By the way, properly ordered. Remember, another characteristic of the second person is judgment. And judgment, we can use this language. Judgment doesn't live over here with individuals and tyranny. Judgment lives over here with persons and relationality. Right? Judgment is what brings things into proper order. If I want to sow the seeds next season, then I must not eat the seeds now. That's judgment. Right? Judgment allows me to orient my perception with reality, with choices now that orient me towards a higher telos.
Another great connection to time preference, by the way. The way you just did that. That was
yeah, that's right.
Time preference, yeah.
So we noticed that if we take a look at Bitcoin, so now I've done a lot of theology. Let me step back. It does appear to be, pardon me, I drank tea right before this, and I think it's dry me out. And we've been talking for 3 hours straight. If I look at let's just use actually the Bible as an architecture. So I have sort of the three apocal events, the things that are the ages of ages. I've got Genesis, I've got Revelation, and then I've got the birth, life, death, and resurrection. Those are the three sort of epochs. Inside those epochs, I have a variety of events that define ages. And I have events like the covenant to Abraham, which enters us into a covenantal space. I have the covenant of Noah, which actually enters us into a covenantal space. And then I have the covenant of Moses. Right? You notice these are like nested. The covenant of Moses sits inside the covenant of Abraham, which sits inside the covenant of Noah. I have then the covenant of David, which sits inside that, by the way. We can say that we're dealing with something at the level of covenant. That Bitcoin is a covenantal technology.
Right. Yes.
If properly deployed. And we should, by the way, be very careful. We can make a mistake of not properly deploying it. The mania and how would you say the degeneracy, which is so characteristic of the same space, tells us that the kind of the prince of this world is hard at work, endeavoring to capture us towards what ultimately looks like timeline 2, by the way, right? Towards a central bank digital currency version of the timeline of Bitcoin.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's we're in it. We're in the middle of choices. It's not given. We have to find a way to remember to subordinate, to orient ourselves properly to the will of the Father, not our own will, for example. But in terms of
sorry to interrupt, but just to define covenant, are you saying it's like an unbreakable promise? Am I understanding that?
Yeah. And it's of the characteristic of sacrament. And by sacrament, what I mean is it moves things out of the ordinary into the extraordinary. It helps us make a distinction. It creates a separation, and that separation has a vector to it. It has this is more than this in terms of more valuable. It allows us to determine and discern value at all. And that creates an orienting basis and points us towards that. Right? So that's what I mean by sacramental. So what a covenant does is a covenant does two things. It moves time. It creates a dividing line in time and creates the sacramental. And it is a commitment to that time that allows us to move towards that time with hope and confidence on the basis of faith. Right? It allows us to have faith. And so Bitcoin is a covenantal technology. Bitcoin allows us to be in a covenantal space. And it's really powerful if you think about what I just said, to think about it in terms of Bitcoin, therefore, is sacramental. We have to think about it properly as sacramental, which means a lot, by the way. Mm-hmm. Right? As soon as you think about something as sacramental, and then you run the risk of profaning it. Think about Moses. Moses is walking up the mountain in his sandals. All is well. The angel of the Lord says, "Remove your sandals. You're standing on hallowed ground. Right? You're standing on sacred ground." As soon as he realizes that he's in sacred ground, brother better take off his sandals, because now he can profane. A child who walks into the Holy of Holies is innocent, let's say. But as soon as you know, or even come close to knowing, I'm going to hold the Ark of the Covenant at the edge for a minute. But as soon as, certainly, let's say, put this, certainly, as soon as you know that you are in sacred ground and you do not remove your sandals, you're engaging in the profane. So if we say that Bitcoin is covenantal technology, then we also mean it's sacramental. That means we need to orient towards it with a certain posture. We need to say, hey, this thing needs to be treated like something that is in fact sacred, not like something that is profane. And again, when I say sacred, all I mean is it orients us towards true value. It separates the ordinary from the valuable and gives us the ability to have that vector at all. It's very critical. Like if you don't have a difference, then everything is indifferent. You're just
Yeah.
running, everything's random. To
Yes.
have non-random, you have to have a difference. That which is more valuable needs to be treated as more valuable. Now, what I could say is, I could say, what is of ultimate value? Okay, well, that's the most sacred. Fair enough. But the fact that things are more valuable, this is also time preference. Hey, how can I have a preference for a longer duration? Well, the reason I have that is because I have the ability to be in relationship with the sacredness of that larger moment, which then allows me to properly orient the local choices across a larger context.
Yes. It's so fantastic. Um, this is coming up for me. And I've heard Viveki talk about this a lot. I hope I'm quoting him correctly. Please correct me where I may be wrong. He's talked about the notion of the one in Platonism or Neoplatonism as something like the unbreakable promise that the structures of intelligibility will remain wedded to the structures of reality. Right? Like there's this underlying metaphysical promise on which all logic, everything is based.
Yeah.
And you can't really use logic to prove that it exists. There's like this faith in the one, basically, which has relations to the idea of God, obviously in Christianity. And so as you were describing it there, I think you said by sacred, you meant oriented toward, keeps you oriented towards what is truly valuable.
Mm-hmm.
And is it that, I mean, it sounds a lot like a Neoplatonic one in a way. It's like how do we get oriented towards what is true? It's like, well, we have to have faith that the structures that we have inherited or evolved as in cognitive agents is corresponding to the structures in reality, right? We can't prove that, but again, we just have to have faith in that.
Mm-hmm.
Does that land? Is that a parallel that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a parallel that makes sense. I mean, short answer is yes, it does.
The other thing, because this other thing that's interesting about money is that it actually does increase our intelligibility, right? We're seeing through the eyes of one another through the price signal. As I mentioned earlier about the copper earthquake in Chile, like you don't need to know about that, but you just
Nice.
know. It's like a fifth P of knowing, maybe. It's like, you got whatever they are: perspectival, propositional, participatory, and then pricing. Pricing is like this other thing.
So try this on as for size because it just occurred to me. In a similar sense that the context of moving through liberalism led us to an inversion or mistake around the notion of sovereignty. So lowercase sovereignty to capital S sovereignty. What I'd like to propose, this is funny, but I think it can be done properly. What I'd like to propose is that I want to restore the notion of priesthood because we also have inherited an inverse notion of priesthood. And our idea of priest, certainly my idea of priest, and I would imagine yours as well, is somebody who at the end of the day wields improper authority and in a place where that authority is actually rather meaningful. So it's like the idea of hypocrite is tightly bound for me in the notion of priest. It's kind of a quality of authoritarianism in the realm of idea, or even in the realm of the sacred. Yeah. And what I want to say is that's that what happened, and I don't mean, by the way, that didn't exist beforehand. Obviously, we have the whole concept of the Pharisees as an example of exactly that happening in the context of early, like late stage Judaism, early stage Christianity. What I want to say, though, is that we moderns have largely lost the possibility of an alternative, as we perceive all priests as being a variation on that type. But I want to say is there's something called a proper priest. And very particularly what I want to say is that Bitcoiners must become proper priests. That's what I really want to urge. Once we've identified that Bitcoin is a covenantal technology, and once we've identified is that as a basic element, what it does is it orients towards what is truly valuable better and better and better over time, and that therefore it is orienting us towards the sacred, then we can say that there's a category of proper posture and proper relationship to things of that sort, which is known as proper priesthood. And that means things like, hey, what you're doing is profane. You need to stop doing that. I care a lot about this thing. I think it's very, very meaningful. And by very, very meaningful, I mean more meaningful than the totality of all civilization. It's very, very meaningful. And what you're doing is wrong. And I mean really seriously wrong. And if you're interested in talking about it, I'm happy to share with you why I think that's the case. But we're going to orient more and more towards those who are operating in that fashion, like who can actually honor the valuable honorably, who can actually have virtue with regard to that which is virtuous and not just virtue signal or even worse, be duplicitous, right? The people who are, if what we're saying is correct, then there's a spiritual war that is very, very fundamental between those who are proper priesthood with regard to Bitcoin and those who are in fact either Pharisaic or even worse, completely hypocritical and are in a depraved version of it. Right? There's a separation there, and that separation is super big. Because if you can corrupt it, you have done something which is absolutely not consummate, consonant with evil. And therefore, to preserve it is to be a most profound spiritual avocation.
Wow. Wow. That is quite a call to action. Yeah, again, sometimes I try to zoom out, I get very into these conversations and I zoom out and try to have the neutral third party, and we always end up sounding crazy cultish because it's I don't know, it's such a
Yes,
big
I'm with you, dude. I mean, I thought you reached out to talk because I spoken with Guy, and
yeah.
I didn't like 300 people watch that, so
Mhm.
and I said I caveated it tremendously, but I am making an argument, and I feel comfortable enough to make that argument publicly, and I imagine more than 300 people will watch this.
Yeah.
That again, proof of work blockchain, which we have been identifying as Bitcoin, is of the same order of magnitude as law, as the substrate upon which law and money sit. It's actually deeper than law and it's deeper than money. It's just above language, right? It's at that level.
It's occurring to me as you're saying that it is a confluence of the three in a way. Because obviously it's written in code, which has its roots in natural language, mathematics, etc.
Yeah.
It is money, and then it has this law-like, um, almost like a transcendent law. How I often describe it is that we've imported the integrity of the laws of physics into the social domain, right? Through proof of work,
Yeah,
energy.
that's right.
That as
We,
as
we've combined
unshakable,
math and physics, which is
yes. So it's a weird. That's maybe why it's such a groundbreaking technology. Is that it's a
and
amalgam of the three.
and as maybe a little bit of an antidote to being sounding too crazy, let's just recapitulate some of the things that we've talked about. We've noticed that we've moved through 500 years, at a minimum, by the way, 500 years of a moment where liberalism created a certain set of architectures. And in many ways, those were good. Like, there were things that happened in there. Like this is the what do you call it? Caterpillar. Right? The caterpillar does things that are necessary, but it doesn't solve the problem of civilization. It's not the answer to the problem of civilization, and it's coming to an end. So we have to get over the confusion, and there's a lot of confusions, right? Over-indexing on individual, as an example, over-indexing on sovereignty as lack of constraint, as opposed to, right? There's a lot of examples there. And this is all of the same order. Right? This is an order of recovering and reestablishing ourselves on a foundation. These are all of the same order of magnitude. When we say that Bitcoin is like this intense, we're also saying things like personhood is that intense. These are not. These are we're in a moment of serious profundity. We're in a moment where big, big, big things are happening, and so we have to be capable of thinking at that level. Right? If we're not thinking at the level of where we are, then we're not in relationship with reality.
Yes.
And then we have to take that responsibility seriously. All right, so fair enough. Like this is it back to that proper priesthood. If you and I go out tomorrow and we immediately blow our Bitcoin on a Lambo, then we should be denounced as hypocrites, right? We're not acting in alignment with what it is that we're expressing. And let that be registered on the blockchain so it can be proven. Right? What I just said, let that be put down there so that it can be held against me. Like
Okay.
I make the covenant that I will live my life in accordance with what I'm expressing, and I have a time preference that is oriented towards the eternal. If I don't, then should deserve rebuke, right? That's kind of we're entering into a mutual relationship inside that covenant, and we have to do that because the magnitude is what we think it is. And of course, we could be wrong, right? Humility is critical. We could be wrong locally. There's all kinds of things that are going on right now that are very complex that I don't understand. And of course, we could be wrong globally. I mean, I could be just completely out of my mind. Can I spend the last 10 minutes just making a distinction?
Please.
Because I noticed just a moment ago, I said, okay, in the very beginning, we made a definition. The thing we've been talking about is proof of work blockchain, and we've been calling it Bitcoin. And the reason why I want to make a distinction right now is I've been around a long time. I remember when the white paper came out. And therefore, I remember all the conversations about the variations. I remember Litecoin was not a get-rich-quick scheme. Litecoin was an alternative approach. They had a different idea of what it should look like. I remember when the big block, little block conflict happened and when Bitcoin split and then split again. Of course, I remember Ethereum and all the others. I stopped paying attention around 2020, but I still paid some attention, but not that level of intimacy. And what I've noticed, my attention has come back online a lot recently for two reasons. One is we've obviously moved into a new state of affairs with regard to Bitcoin. The center of the neoliberal world order has, whether or not you believe Trump is relevant or not, has at least officially declared Bitcoin to be a strategic reserve, which is not the kind of shit that would have been on anybody's bingo card 3 years ago, much less 10 years ago.
Yeah.
All right, so and nation states, and by the way, civilization states are taking it a level of seriousness that was shocked people out of their gourds just a tiny, tiny fraction ago. What that means then is that in all likelihood, things are going to continue to build and build relatively rapidly, which means, by the way, that a lot of the things we've talked about in terms of the form of money start to matter. Right? Like I mentioned, I think that the choices built both spiritually and physically around BTC lead to failure conditions that we don't want to have. Like this, it's not the right. Now I'm getting like really low level. This is like detailed stuff. And as I've been having to now take that seriously, up until now, it's like, yeah, whatever. Maybe eventually we'll have to deal with that, and we have ways to deal with it. Basically, a fork. Okay, so what is it? But now I have to take it seriously. Like, shit, this might happen soon. Like, we might actually have a flop at any point. We could see Bitcoin pop to 250K, and that creates craziness. All right, what do we do next? So then I started going back out and say, okay, well, what's happened in the world in the past 5 years? The thing that came to me was this thing called QUAI, QUAI, which if you haven't seen it, I would recommend taking a look at it, because my old school chops tell me that it's actually the most interesting thing happening right now. It has all the design characteristics of what I think might be the right form of proof of work blockchain. Do you know it at all?
No, I don't. I'll let you finish, and then I'll share my view in general on Bitcoin versus shitcoin, if you like.
Yeah. I am utterly uninterested in shitcoins.
Yeah.
But I'm concerned that the BTC version has the two significant wrong characteristics. And QUAI may in fact be the alternative. So it is proof of work, obviously minimum. Everything else is irrelevant in the immediate term. I mean, eventually we might find they're useful on top of the substrate, but it's there. It has a different approach to how it does entropy, which is not radically different. It's a very small difference. And I'm convinced that it's a difference that Satoshi would have been like, yeah, that's the right answer. Meaning it is the right answer. If you dig into their POEM technology, proof of entropy minimization, and spend time on it, you'll be like, yeah, that is a much better approach and elegant and powerful, because what it does is it allows you to run an ordinary proof of work blockchain and get extremely high transactions per second, which then enabled them to split it into two currencies that are in relationship with each other. They basically solve the problem of the big small block. Instead of having a store of value big block, or a unit of account, medium of exchange, small block. They actually
Vice
have
versa,
two.
but yeah, only
They have two that are part of the same proof of work blockchain in relationship with each other, which I think is also stable. We don't know about that. It's very tiny. It's only like 2 months old. So it has not got the gold standard of being tested. But at an architectural level, it's very intriguing because that's the right. If I actually did, if you look at it and say, what should it look like? It should look like that. And the small currency, or the currency that is designed to be stable, is stable grounded on energy with an approach that I think is also very elegant. So this is nice, right? Because now I have a stable coin, which is oriented towards energy as the stability. So it's not stable in relationship with USD. It's not stable in relationship with some kind of algorithmic structure, which is ultimately trying to ground it on USD. It's stable with regard to energy, which is where we'd like it to be ultimately. There's a couple of other characteristics to it from a design perspective. I really like it. And so what I'd love is for other people who are taking a properly priestly relationship with this covenantal technology to look at it. And if I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong and why. Because I take it very seriously. I think that should be treated sacred.
Hmm. But no, it's interesting. I would definitely like to take a look. My general view is that Bitcoin's the only thing that's been it's proven itself as decentralized, whereas
Yep.
anything else that's been launched in its wake, I don't think you can ever, I don't want to say ever, it's very unlikely that it can cross the chasm from centralized to decentralized. And but if that particular feature that you're describing, poem, were actually proven to be there were product market fit basically.
Mm-hmm.
And I think projects like that, which I classify all non Bitcoin cryptos as shitcoins, that's just my
Oh,
general
okay.
they function as kind of like a test net for Bitcoin. So say Poem were like definitively
Could
market
be.
proof,
Yep.
that would probably get imported into Bitcoin and then Bitcoin would continue.
Which is a very, very viable, like if that could happen, because the ultimate would happen is you'd have to modify, the miners would have to modify and shift. But if they did, then that
Yeah.
would unlock, and that's fine. Exactly. So
Yeah.
that's the level of the conversation is, hey, we have a
Yeah.
new innovation. This innovation is very powerful. It changes structures into fashion, which theoretically is better
Yep.
across three different dimensions. I'd like this community, the ones who take it seriously, to look at it pretty closely, quite
Yes.
closely.
No, that is a fair ask, and I appreciate you presenting it that way. The other thing that would concern me actually is like it might even be better, but there is a path dependence is also an issue,
Path
right?
dependence is real. Yep.
Just the horse has left the stable, whatever analogy you want to use, and unless it is that kind of 10x number better as determined by market participants, then sometimes the better technology actually doesn't get adopted, which is
True. However, remember, Windows, we've noticed in the past that the first technology rarely wins, even though it always has first mover advantage.
but sure.
MySpace, it
Yeah.
typically because it drops the ball, by the way. MySpace dropped the ball to Facebook.
Yeah.
I can't remember what the streaming service was that preceded YouTube, but dropped the ball to YouTube. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
Windows 1 did not have it. Windows 3, Windows 95. So it takes a while to dial it in. So there's I'd be surprised if we were locked in. I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't a lot of headwinds. I mean, for
Yeah.
sure, there's a lot of headwinds.
Definitely a lot of headwinds. I mean, just the $2 trillion market cap alone is a lot of headwinds, right?
It's a lot of money.
And the counter to that counter is that it's like the internet, right? Like, well, the internet hasn't been disrupted or countered. It's the open network that keeps adopting and changing, and it's like a hyper object basically. So
In some sense, yeah, it is.
yeah. And so Bitcoin is, I think that's probably the best. Well, we have a couple of good metaphors, right? Digital gold or the internet of money. I think these are probably the most useful, most descriptive metaphors for Bitcoin or analogies for Bitcoin if you really understand those things deeply, like
Yep.
internet and gold and money. So I
I'm
don't
gonna,
know.
I'm gonna put one more. I'm gonna put
Yep.
one more, and this speaks. I used this a while back as a self-organizing collective intelligence. Now, this is not a metaphor that is
Yeah.
easy, but it speaks to this notion of the price function. It speaks to the notion
Yeah.
of neurons,
Sounds like a
and
market.
it sounds like a market, right? So
Yeah.
it has that. And the question is it a mature neurology?
Yes.
If it's a mature neurology, then it now becomes a stage upon which things are built.
Right.
If it's an immature neurology, the step functions can be quite large. Right? A
Yes.
neuron that can't create axons, it can create synapses but not axons, will be very successful until somebody invents axons, in which case it just goes away.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful, wonderful point. Jordan, this has been an awesome conversation. I knew I was going to enjoy it, but man, you really took it to the next level. So I really appreciate it. We didn't even get to cover everything, but do you have any parting words of wisdom for the audience? And if not, could you just please let people know where they can find you on the internet?
Oh gosh. Well, with regard to the last part, the way I understand that is that if you're supposed to find me, you'll find me. And I would strongly recommend you don't. So only if it really needs to happen, in which case you'll find me. With regard to the former words of wisdom, what I was noticing as we were talking is like, man, we've covered a lot of ground. And some of this has been very dense. Probably all of it, but even from my point of view, some of this has been very dense. And if you feel like you need to go back and watch it again, on the one hand, I'm very sorry. And on the other hand, I'm very impressed.
That is a great place to bring it to a close. And yes, I too have found myself rewatching a lot of your stuff because it is dense, but I don't know. I enjoy trying to work my way through that. And maybe that's trying to be on this pathway to proper priesthood you described. Like maybe that's the right thing, the right label for it. It is. It's something new, it's not.
That had the feeling to me of valor and nobility.
Yes, exactly.
Nice.
Thank you so much, man.
You as well. Blessings.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money, and be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.